On behalf of the University of Western Australia, it's my great pleasure to warmly welcome you all to the UWA Institute of Agriculture's 18th Annual Industry Forum. So I was telling the manager here, we need a discount for hiring this hall 18 years in a row. He hasn't given that. Before we get started, first some housekeeping. In the unlikely event of an emergency, exits are located at the front of the auditorium, both sides. The washrooms are at the back, so you can exit via this front door and follow the corridor around the left past the outdoor foyer. Although I must ask you now to please switch your mobile phones to silent, you're welcome to take photos, tweet, and share your experience at our industry forum on social media. If you have questions for our speakers and panelists, rest assured we will have roving microphones during the audience Q&A at the end. The University of Western Australia acknowledges that it is situated on Noongar land, and the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. We are extremely fortunate to be joined by Heidi Mippy, who will lead our welcome to the country today. Heidi is an Indigenous Liaison Manager at Curtin University and co-lead the Socio-Economics team at the ARC, Australian Research Council, Training Centre for Healing the Country. She previously worked with the Noongar Land Enterprises to support the Noongar land owners to develop economic opportunities through their properties. Heidi holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Adult Education, Community Management from the University of Technology, Sydney. From Murdoch University, she holds a graduate certificate in Business Administration, specialization in Leadership, Strategy, and Innovation, and an Executive Master's in Leadership, Strategy, and Innovation. She's on the board of Rural Regional Remote Women's Network, Blue Benin Projects, and Digidi Aboriginal Women's Corporation, which provides services to improve the lives of women, children, families in the Melville, Fremantle, Coburn, and Kunana areas. Please welcome Heidi.
Thank you. While we're talking about the jitty, which is what you were trying to talk about there, the little bird, I've just come from another event, Natural Capital Accounting event, and in my talk I just acknowledge that I stand on the shoulders of giants. Some of those are my Yamaji ancestors from the Upper Gascoyne, but where we are today, Wajak Noongar elders and ancestors, and one of my totems is the jitty, which was hanging around on the balcony, so everybody noticed, and when we had our photo out here, he's there also today. So I want to pay my respects to my old people who I know are always with me when I sit on country and when I hold space for people in moments like this to share some of our knowledge. So hello and welcome to everybody to today's event. I felt very honoured to get the invitation to be able to do a welcome. I would have attended as a participant. I want to talk a little bit about a welcome to country, because sometimes they feel a little bit overdone and tokenistic. I'm just going to call that out as the Noongar in the room. So I thought I might remind people around why we do a welcome. And when we do a welcome traditionally, often this is a process that's taken over time. So it's not we're standing here and we're doing it in a matter of minutes. I want to acknowledge that there are many, many people in this room, and I can see so many familiar faces, where I feel that we've sat in spaces and we've shared stories and we've showed our intent together to sit on country for a shared vision or purpose. So to me, I feel like we've been on this journey of what we would traditionally do as a welcome to country to talk about this very issue of caring for country, whatever that looks like or means to you. So I want to say thank you for your stewardship and your time and your commitment to our beautiful Budja. as well as the tens and thousands of years of stewardship that Noongar people and other First Nations people have demonstrated over time. What I would like to share with you, just briefly before we move on to the rest of the day, is what I call the Noongar worldview, and I shared this at Natural Capital Accounting Symposium this morning. And the Noongar worldview is like an ecosystem that is a web of connectivity and connection. In the heart of that is what we call Budja, and Budja isn't physically the land that we stand on. Budja is all things connected to that land that we stand or sit on or work on. And in that is also culture. Around this centre of Budja and culture, we have things like first law, language, reciprocity, responsibility, and all of these things that feed into this web. So for us as Noongar people, we have a massive responsibility and obligation to care for country, and that is the country that everyone has and the only country that we have. And we have an absolute responsibility to uphold that today, as well as what we did in the past and for future generations. I'd like to think that together we can, as we talk and explore the topics for today, that we can look at how the Noongar worldview, or First Nations worldview, fits into the work and practice and the stories that you do, and how we can see the values and the measurements brought into the systems that we're looking at today. And I think that might make sense as we go through the day. So I would like to again say thank you all for coming along today. Thanks for the invitation to be here. We sit here on the beautiful Boorloo, which is Perth here in Wajak Noongar Budja, and I know that the old people are already with us, and I hope that their presence is also felt by you as we go through today's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, very much. We are extremely thankful to your passion and perspective and commitment based on your CV and so on. Certainly we'll be looking upon you on future activities, especially on our farm in Pingelly. Invited speakers, distinguished guests, UWA colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It is wonderful to see so many people here who are passionate about agriculture in this great state and beyond. I would like to especially acknowledge Honourable Minister Reece Whitby MLA, who you will hear from very soon. UWA's Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Tim Colmer, our Industry Advisory Board Chair Terry Enright, and members Dr. Ben Bidalp, who joined the Advisory Board just recently, Carly Veach, Dr. Hayley Norman, Rod Birch, and Belinda Eastow. They are the members present today, but we have got a number of others who have sent apologies. Formerly Industry Advisory Board members who we continue to work closely with, Dr. Bruce Mullen and Philip Gardner. The WA Agriculture Research Collaboration Director, Dr. Kelly Pierce, CBH Group CEO, Ben McNamara, Emerita Professor Lynn Abbott, Emeritus Professor Graham Martin, CRC for High Performance Soils Board Member Robbie Sefton AM, Rabobank National Farm Support Manager Crawford Taylor, the Honourable Colin D. Graziers MLA from the Nationals Western Australia, and WA's Counsel General for the United Kingdom, Maria Rennie, and Deputy Director of DPERD, Cecilia McConnell. In the UWA, in the academic ranking of world universities for 2023, UWA is ranked 22nd in the world for agriculture. I think there are some comments saying, oh, that's a Crawley-based ranking. No, it is not a Crawley-based ranking. It is a real ranking based on real metrics. And we follow a number of rankings, but as a scientist, I find this ranking very useful to benchmark our performance over the years. Once again, we maintained or retained the #1 position in Australia. The Institute has played a significant role in achieving this goal and reputation. the UWA Institute of Agriculture was re-established by the university in 2007 with a mandate to integrate research, education, training, and communication in agriculture and related areas across the university, and also, more importantly, engage with other institutions within Western Australia, and more importantly, globally. The Industry Forum is an annual event that is one of the highlights in our calendar. Over the years, we have explored many topics from the new technologies and innovations in agriculture to national and international shifts in the industry. And most of these presentations are available. If you can't find that on the website, please do contact us. Looking at the impressive crowd of people in this auditorium today, it is clear that this year's topic has struck a chord. I'm very proud that our Industry Advisory Board has put together an excellent program to help explore the burning question, can agriculture reach net zero? I think one of the slides is missing. Of course, today they would not be possible without CSBP fertilizers. We thank them for their long-time support. The banner is there. For the forum, from the CSBP and Farmers Golden Jubilee of Agriculture Science Fellowship held at UWA since 1965. I think one of the slides not right. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Honourable Reece Whitby MLC to formally open the 2024 Industry Forum. Minister Whitby is Western Australian Minister for Energy, Environment, Climate Action, and member of the Graziers. He has overseen government departments responsible for protecting Western Australia's environment since December 2021 and gained the energy portfolio in December 2023. Minister Whitby is coordinating the state's response to climate change while establishing a whole-of-government approach to reduce emissions. He is WA's first minister to attend a United Nations Climate Change Conference, addressing the audience at COP27 and meeting ministerial counterparts from across the globe. He followed that up by attending COP28 in December 2023. Minister Whitby is tasked with implementing WA's national leading plan for plastics and the Cook government's historic decision to end native logging from 2024. As the Minister for Environment, he is responsible for delivering plan for our parks, oversee transformation of the Southwest interconnected system, and the state government's decision to exit coal-fired power by 2030. Minister Whitby was first appointed to the cabinet in the McGovern Labour government in 2021 as the Minister for Emergency Service, Racing, Gaming, Small Business and Volunteering. He became the first local member for the new electorate of Graziers in March 2017. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Minister Whitby.
Thank you, Professor Sadiq, and appreciate that introduction. It's probably a bit too much information on me. Also, Heidi, Mippy, thank you for your welcome to country. It's very insightful and interesting, and always it's the First Nations people who understand how to care for country best. So, and indeed, the climate change represents a challenge for everyone, but I know it's heartfelt with the Indigenous communities across Western Australia. Can I also acknowledge we are on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people on this beautiful Budja. Can I also acknowledge Professor Sadiq? Appreciate the introduction. Michael Crawford, the Chief Executive Officer of the CRC for High Performance Soils, and the Pastoralists and Graziers Association President Tony Seabrook. Welcome along. Also a colleague of mine, the Honourable Colin de Grooser MLC. Colin's daughter and my son were with a bunch of kids who went to a farm on the school holidays. So, I know it was an opportunity for my son, a city kid, to get involved and appreciate life in the regions and on a farm. So I know he had a wonderful time, and they've survived that, and they're all back in Perth safely, which is good. Good to know. As a bit of a city slicker, a kid that was raised in Perth, one of my best mates is an agricultural advisor, and we've been good mates for more than 20 years. And we go to the footy. We're long-suffering Dockers supporters. So for 20 years, whether it's socialising, we go to the footy every other week. We share information, and I've gained a great appreciation of the agricultural industry through him. I've gained an interest in the forecast. I think it was Tony that pointed out Friday night there's a front coming in, very important. We hope it gets right through the wheat belt. But my friend spends every week in the wheat belt, comes back to Perth on the Friday, and we catch up on the weekend. So I get an update on agriculture, and he has his farmer meetings, and so I actually get a real insight into his on-the-ground experience, which I appreciate. Look, it is a great honour to be here today for this 18th Industry Forum. Looking at the topics covered previously, very, very interesting. And this year's topic is can agriculture reach net zero? Obviously a very important theme as far as I'm concerned as Minister for Climate Action and the Environment. We know that agriculture is a hard to abate industry in terms of its emissions. So there's a big challenge there. And of course we know the importance of agriculture to Western Australia. We talk about mining and resources, but agriculture plays a very big role in our industry and the commercial life of the state. But there's also huge challenges in agriculture for emission reduction, but also enormous opportunities. So no one in Western Australia is more exposed to climate change than our state's farmers. Many of you here today already see and feel its impact. It has a direct impact on livelihood and well-being. Whether you're a farmer or work in research, education, climate change is shaping how you think about the future. You recognise the enormous impact climate change is having, and you know it must be addressed as a matter of urgency. Now, luckily, many of you aren't just among the most innovative minds in Australia, you're also among the most adaptable and highly skilled professionals in the world. We know that WA's farmers have for decades adapted to a drying and warming climate, and it's evidenced by our state's production yields increasing in the past 30 years despite more challenging conditions. We've seen record harvests in the last few years, and it's really a credit to the ingenuity and the science and the adaptability of local farmers to adapt to a harsher environment but still increase yields at the same time. So now climate change will bring with it new opportunities to adapt and evolve. Many of you already sell carbon offsets and credits, and some of you farm wind alongside your produce and livestock. And as our major trading partners are rapidly decarbonising, many of you will benefit from the premium that European and Asian buyers are willing to pay for low emission products. This is not a new phenomenon. Lowering emissions is good for business. That's why WA's low emissions canola is competitive and successful in European markets. Our state's farmers are uniquely susceptible to shifts in consumer and market preferences. WA's agriculture, fisheries and forestry value chains are worth 50 billion with a B a year, and this supports nearly 180,000 jobs. So it's clear farmers are simply too important to be left behind by climate change. That's why our government is working to ensure everyone here today plays a key role in the new economy. We must keep researching and supporting decarbonisation, not just because it is the right thing to do, but because it will maintain our state's competitive advantage on the world stage. Our low emissions products will keep our state's products where they have been for decades, on the supermarket shelves of countries all over the world. We're not naive. Agriculture is an emissions-intensive sector. Indeed, it's one of our state's hardest to abate sectors, as I've already mentioned. It's a fact that WA agriculture emits less than the national average, and if we're to maintain this position of strength, we must aim higher. Agriculture in WA must capitalise on opportunities for economic growth that come from decarbonisation, develop low-carbon industries and diversify our economy. And the potential is plain to see. Close to 40% of WA's land is used for agricultural purposes. That's an area about 4 times the size of the United Kingdom. This means there is significant potential for our state to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through carbon sequestration. Carbon farming schemes throughout Western Australia are already aiding in generating WA-sourced carbon credits and income. There are more opportunities in the offing as the global market for offsets will inevitably grow. Farmland can't be a carbon sink though. It needs to decarbonise too. That's dealt with by our sectoral emissions reduction strategy. That strategy charts a path for so much of what will be important in the decades to come, including in agriculture. It outlines innovative solutions for lowering agricultural emissions, and this includes the possibility of developing and commercialising nitrogen-inhibiting fertilisers and replacing imported feed ingredients with local low-emission alternatives. Already our government has identified possible biofuel opportunities with large-scale advanced biofuel projects in development in Western Australia. And we're investing $4.2 million in Curtin as part of a practical demonstration of how farms can achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. And that work will supplement our government's energy policies. These include developing microgrids and standalone power systems that will help decarbonise producers in regional WA who rely on off-the-grid or end-of-line power. Another critical issue in the regions is getting a supply of reliable electricity, and microgrids are a solution that avoids that end-of-line vulnerability. This isn't just an environmental challenge, it's an economic one as well. Our government is committed to building on our state's strengths to address climate change and make it a great opportunity. I always say that Western Australia, of all the states, faces the greatest challenge in terms of getting to net zero. We are the greatest emitters, so we have the greatest challenge, but we also have the greatest opportunities. We have the landscape, the sun, the wind, and the ingenuity of being West Australians that we can really take hold of opportunities, grasp opportunities for new industries. And agriculture is very much part of that story. I hope everyone here today can use this important forum to discuss how you can use your strengths to be part of the solution. So I'll leave you there. I've got a bunch of meetings this afternoon, so I will stay for as long as I can, but I wish you the best of luck in this forum and hope it's an enjoyable day for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for opening our industry forum today, Minister, and also some of the activities by your government doing in relation to that, and hope we can call upon you, the climate action. There's more to be done, and Western Australia can play a significant role. We have got the intellectual horsepower, but also we have the farmers and the clever farmers and the correct environment. So thank you once again. I would now like to introduce our Master of Ceremonies for today, Dr. Terry Enright. As many of you will remember, last year I mentioned that Terry became one of the just 7 people to receive the GRDC's Seed of Gold Award, a passionate and a dedicated farmer, ex-farmer. He is widely considered to be a legend in WA and Australian grains industry for a number of initiatives, which I will mention few. In addition to his long-time role as the chair of the UWA Institute of Agriculture Industry Advisory Board, Terry was appointed as the inaugural chair of the new industry peak body of the grains in 2020. Terry has more than 4 decades experience in agriculture and held numerous high-profile positions, including the former chair of the Grains Research and Development Corporation. Prior to that, he was the chair of the Western panel of the GRDC for a number of years. I had the privilege to work under him as a panel member at that time. And he's also worked on the Australian Livestock Export Corporation during some turbulent times, and the Australian Exports Grains Innovation Centre in establishing that centre, and AGIC, which is still going very well. So please welcome Terry.
Thank you, Professor Sadiq, for the introduction. Yeah, like the Minister said, probably a bit much information, but anyway, we'll move on. Thank you for that. Thank you, Minister, for the opening address. Appreciate your input to the forum. It's much appreciated. Welcome, everybody. I will, firstly, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, but just a few words about the Industry Advisory Board, who I have the privilege to chair at this time. The board plays a critical role in assisting the Institute in its strategic direction and its interaction with industry. It's made up of farmers and representatives from organisations such as CSIRO, CBH, CSBP, Intergrain, the Australian Agriculture Consultants. We have farmers, the Department of Primary Industries and Research Development. So quite a mix of people from right across the spectrum of agriculture, and collectively we try and provide input into the Institute of Agriculture and assist the Institute in its development of its priorities. It also serves as an avenue for industry to understand and work with and understand what the university does. So there's a two-way flow there. But one of the most important things we do each year is in terms of contribution to agriculture is this annual forum, and you saw on the screen just a while ago we've run a number of very successful forums over the years. So we look at current and future issues for the ag industry and tend to try to bring people together to focus on that as we are today. So, and I'm sure you're aware, it's been very clear that this year's topic, can agriculture reach net zero? No, there's probably few terms have become as common as in the first half of the 2020s of net zero. It's become a topic of discussion. And it was first used after the IPCC's report in 2018. And the goal that came out of that was CO2 emissions decline 45% on 210 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. That's very ambitious, and the implications of that, as legislators, Australia has signed up to this to the agreements. So legislators will put in place various rules and regulations, perhaps, to make sure that we play a part. So we're very keen to understand what is the effect of agriculture. You know, what are we going to be faced with? There are costs, and the measures. How do they affect agriculture? We've seen in other parts of the world where some of the introductions in Europe of various measures have met with quite a lot of resistance. So let's explore that. What are the costs, and also what are the benefits? So because it's so topical, that's why we're here today to discuss it. So we'll move on. But enough from me. I don't want to talk for too long because it's important that I introduce Dr. Michael Crawford, a keynote address. Dr. Michael Crawford, he's had over 25 years experience in extension research and science management areas related to soil science, farming systems and natural resource management. Michael has an honours degree of agriculture science from the University of Melbourne, PhD in soil science from the University of Adelaide, undertaken through the former CRC for soil and land management. His PhD looked at quantifying the below ground inputs of organic carbon under pasture, so very topical in terms of what we're discussing today. Following a long research career with Agriculture Victoria, Michael commenced as the inaugural CEO of the Cooperative Research Centre for High Performance Soils, known as the Soil CRC now. He commenced that in September 2017. He oversees research collaborations with 39 contributors and partners across Australia, working together to help farmers better manage their soils. He currently sits on the Implementation Steering Committee for Australia's National Soil Strategy, and in the past he was a member of the working group that wrote the Australian National Soil Research Development Extension Strategy. He has an ongoing interest in helping farmers to better manage their soils for sustainable productivity and profitability. Can you please join with me and welcome Dr. Michael Crawford.
So good afternoon all. Firstly, thank you to Professor Sadiq for his invitation to be the keynote speaker. Quite a daunting task with the topic to cover quite a broad range of information to a very diverse audience. So I'm a scientist by training and long-time manager, executive, etc. So I'm well used to trying to pitch a conversation to different audiences, having worked in extension and research and management, etc., from farmers to researchers to politicians. So, a couple of caveats and disclaimers up front. What I go through in this presentation, pretty much every slide, there'll be some people here who will know a lot more about that bit of information than I do. Pretty much every slide is a simplification of a very complex story in many cases. But I think that's my task here today, to try to make some of that complexity a bit more digestible and understandable. At the same time, potentially address a few myths and misconceptions in relation to some of these areas. And I'd like to think with my science training, what I'm talking to you about, yes, it's my perspective, it's my opinion, but it's based on evidence, it's based on science. I'll also sort of introduce things by saying Terry made reference to some of my history as a PhD student. In the mid-90s, I had the opportunity to go to a conference in the United States on soil carbon sequestration. This is 1996. Attracted about 100, 150 people, soil scientists, all talking around, this climate change thing. Maybe there's some opportunities here. Maybe with all those emissions, maybe there's some opportunities to be able to sequester carbon in our soils and build soil organic matter and the like at the same time. That was great, very exciting for a young PhD student to be amongst these learned voices. Here we are 30 years later, very much a mainstream conversation. How can soil carbon be used to sequester or draw down gases, atmospheric CO2 and offset emissions elsewhere? So I've been very much watching that conversation go from a small field of soil scientists sort of pumping each other up in their very closeted world to the broader world of understanding from ministers and the like, very much looking at what can we be doing to meet our obligations and actually have an impact globally. So, thank you Terry for the introduction, Minister, distinguished guests. It's a great pleasure to be across here from the Eastern States. I'm now based in Melbourne. I have moved around a bit in the years. And it's great to come across to Western Australia. I've been a regular visitor the last few years since looking after, taking on this job as CEO of the Soil CRC. I came across Monday. I had a day yesterday in the wheat belt up to our West Midlands group, one of our partners in the CRC, looking at some of our sites here. I am taller than many, thank you. Yes. and seen some beautiful countryside along the way. So I'm going to address, as keynote speaker, address the main topic, can agriculture reach net zero, and in particular come at it from a soil carbon perspective. But I will touch upon some other issues. But firstly, just a couple of words around the soil CRC. It is a collaboration of farmers, industry and scientists, 39 partners. We've got 8 universities, including Murdoch University here in Western Australia. We've got 4 government agencies, 7 industry groups, and importantly, we've got 20 grower groups or farmer groups, which helps to give us that end user pool, that pathway to market, that route to adoption. In Western Australia, we've got groups such as West Midlands, as I mentioned, one for West Australia, No-Till, Corrigan, Facey, Leby, Gillamai, and Wheatbelt NRM, so all active partners in the CRC. Essentially, our purpose is to deliver research that helps farmers improve their soil productivity and profitability, and we've got 10 years funding. We commenced in 2017 until 2027, so we just commenced year 8. We're into the last 3 years of a CRC, so we're getting to the pointy end of starting to wrap things up and deliver. But over the journey, that partnership and investment we've had from the Australian government and from our partners, both cash and in kind, has made it the largest collaborative soil research effort in Australia's history. Those groups, those partners are spread across Australia. It really is a nationwide effort with a large focus on regional areas, as you might expect from a soil CRC. I'm going to jump right in and answer the question from my perspective. With all those caveats I had up front, can agriculture reach net zero? No. So there's the answer, and now the rest of my talk will help to be explaining and justifying, defending that position and giving it more context. So I say no, but also a couple of disclaimers. Maybe individual farms can, and maybe for a period of time. Maybe individual industries can, but are less emissions intensive, and maybe in some regions we can. However, as an agriculture sector, I'm going to say no. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and that's the important part that we need to get right. There's a whole lot of reasons here why we should be doing this. Let's touch upon those international policy drivers that were referenced by the Minister. Most often in presentations like this in the last so many years, a keynote speaker would start with a graph, a slide showing increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. They then follow up with a slide showing increased average temperatures and global warming, etc. I think we're well beyond me trying to talk to you about, hey, we've got a problem here. I think everyone's seen many of those slides. Well, let's move into, so what are we doing about it and what's the context? We have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Conference of Parties, the COP, coming together every few years. There's a milestone COP in COP21 in 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement, where collectively the world's countries agreed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and in turn to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. In 2022 at COP26 in Glasgow, they started to set targets, to set pathways on that road to net zero emissions by 2050, and collectively agreed to reduce global emissions by 45% of 2010 levels by 2030. So from that starts to flow a whole range of initiatives, of policies, of legislation, of directions, of programs, etc., at national levels, in our case at state levels like we're doing here in Western Australia. Australia is now committed to a pathway net zero to reduce emissions to 43% below 2005 levels by 2035. There's all sorts of starting points and target points here, but everyone's heading in the same direction, and that's one of the drivers that helps to influence what we're talking about here. But it's not only countries that are doing it. We have our supply chains, especially in the food and agriculture context. Many of our large multinational global food corporations are setting their targets as well. There's names there that you'll recognise in an increasingly consolidated supply chain world who have made very public declarations about their pathways to net zero and what they're going to achieve along the way. In many cases, not with all the detail about how they're going to do it, but in many cases, those obligations will be passed upon onto their supply chain, which commences with farmers in many cases. So our markets are demanding it. We made reference earlier to a low emissions canola story. In Europe, they're looking to the suppliers to be able to verify and justify that who they're buying from, they know what their carbon footprint is, and they're taking actions to reduce it. So there's a whole lot of drivers here that are leading us towards we need to be active in doing something. And the other reason why there's two more reasons why we need to be active in doing something. One is climate change is impacting upon us. We made reference to earlier, and in Australia, agriculture, and in West Australia especially, agriculture is exposed to climate change. We can't expect everybody else to be doing something about it if we're not making a contribution ourselves. And the other point I want to make through this talk is actually doing something about climate change, reducing your emissions, increasing your sequestration, is actually good farm practice. It actually leads to productivity improvements and increases. And so bringing it back to the individual or the individual farming business, there's actually many win-win-wins here in doing this. Not always easily achievable and attainable, but we can make it work. So this is one of those simplification slides. So net emissions is what we're talking about. When you look at Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture, depending what year it is, what figures, somewhere around 14, 16, 17% of emissions comes from the agriculture sector. The other big contributing sectors, of course, are around energy, transport, mining, manufacturing. From within that agriculture, those gross emissions, methane is a large one, especially for our livestock, our ruminants, our sheep and cattle. Nitrous oxide for the use of fertilisers, manures. Carbon dioxide to some extent for urea use and lime application. Depending on which way you're approaching this, where you're doing the sums and what's included, what's not. But in an agriculture sense, the carbon dioxide emissions associated with on-farm fuel, energy, electricity use, electricity where it's from non-renewable sources, all count as part of this. If we're to offset those gross emissions to achieve net zero, the sequestration occurs through vegetation, through trees, remnant vegetation protection, etc., and through soil carbon sequestration. That equals net emissions. Now, the point I'm going to make here is that there's a lot of work going on to reduce those gross emissions. There's a lot of work being done to increase that sequestration opportunities, but we've still got a long way to go such that the sequestration opportunities cancel out the emissions that we have. Again, doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And coming back to the methane, there's a lot of work being done, has been going on, been funded through our RDCs, through governments at various levels, and now for the CRC for zero net emissions, which is looking to what are the advances we can make in pastures, feed, in ruminant nutrition, in genetics to reduce methane emissions. And everything that you do to reduce methane emissions means that that energy is converted into actual livestock gain or other more monetisable type products. Similarly with nitrous oxide, a lot of work being done around how we can reduce the emissions coming from our fertiliser use, urea and associated products, around the 4 Ps that the fertiliser industry talks about: right place, right product, right time, right rate, combined with nitrification inhibitors, and now the focus on enhanced efficient fertilisers, and how we can reduce nitrous oxide emissions from the use of that. But given that nitrogen is a key building block to protein, protein is what drives the world in terms of our food, we still need to be using nitrogen fertilisers in many cases. There's still going to be emissions associated with that still need to be offset. A carbon dioxide, on-farm fuel and electricity use. That's where the Minister's programs comes into it, how we use those renewable energy sources and how we store energy in different ways to be able to reduce our dependency and hence the emissions of CO2 from fossil fuel-based energy sources. So I'm going to dive a bit more into soil carbon. So a bit of context around soil carbon in Australia, and recognising some of the words in our welcome to country, recognising here in Australia we have over 40,000 years more by some estimates of Indigenous land management. And what our Indigenous peoples did was to manage the land in different ways. Cultural burning, the use of fire in the landscape was a key part of that. And diving into the detail, when you look at our soil carbon and you look at the different pools of soil carbon, we have what we call these recalcitrant or long-term storage pools, essentially charcoal, which has come about from burning in the past, be it cultural burning or natural burning. But essentially a lot of that charcoal that's in our soil carbon as we know it was put there before Europeans came along, before the last 200 years. It's been there for 1,000 years plus. So in the last 150 to 200 years we've had European land management. Agriculture across the country made a significant contribution to our economy, to regional development. We produce 3 to 4 times more food than what we consume. However, it's come at a cost. We've got increased soil degradation, we've got decreased soil organic matter and organic carbon in many of our soil profiles. The flip side is an opportunity exists to rebuild that soil organic matter, to bring it back up to closer to where it was, and by nature to sequester carbon, to draw down that atmospheric carbon. So that's sort of the logic, the place, the role that soil carbon has in this whole story. Some of you know this quite well, but I'm putting up the soil carbon cycle. And just to take you through a few basic points that I want to make. Essentially, carbon doesn't exist in soil by itself, it exists as soil organic matter. So carbon is there with other nutrients and nitrogen, phosphorus, sulphur, potassium, etc. It's captured from the atmosphere by photosynthesis. When all is said and done, that's the way that carbon gets into the soil. No other magic process by which sometimes a miracle is said to occur. It's released back to the atmosphere by decomposition and by respiration. However, a portion is stored in the soil in various pools, as we call them as scientists, with varying residence times. When that fast turnover, that labile, very quick turnover through the medium and intermediate to slow turnover, that charcoal type thing. And if you take a bank balancer or a monetary type approach to it, it's sort of like your long-term term deposits versus your everyday access account versus the money that you got in your pocket, which generally gets spent first. And so collectively, it's all your money, but we want to move more and more into those longer term pools. In talking about soil carbon and talking about it in a greenhouse gas perspective and carbon sequestration, we need to not lose sight of the fact that it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions, but soil organic carbon, soil organic matter has many benefits in addition to offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking about enhanced soil structure, we're talking about enhanced water infiltration, enhanced water holding capacity, all very important issues here in Western Australia, soil types. We're talking about the supply of nutrients, release of nutrients to growing plants. We're talking about being an energy source for microbes, really driving the soil biology, soil biological cycles and more. But going a bit further, I want to talk about what I call the triple M of soil carbon. There's really 3 aspects to this soil carbon sequestration story. There's the making and maintaining, the measuring and monitoring, and the marketing and monetising. And what we hear a lot about is how we measure and monitor it, how we market and monetise it, but my preface is that we haven't quite got the making and maintaining aspect of it right yet. I'm going to touch upon items, dot points 2 and 3 first before coming back to the making. So again, just conveying a few of the simple points around measuring and monitoring soil carbon. Essentially, carbon sequestration is the difference, a positive difference, an increase, in soil organic carbon between 2 points of time. It's not the amount of soil carbon you already have in the soil, which has been there for all along. You can't claim that as a credit. It's the increase that we're talking about. And that's calculated as a factor of the soil carbon, organic carbon concentration, what we see in our soil tests, percentage organic carbon, bulk density, how much soil you've got in a given area, and depth, generally 0 to 30 centimetres. And that's represented as tonnes of carbon per hectare. Measurement is an issue, and it's one of the barriers to getting this through. And typically, our measurement approach is just to take a sample, send it to the laboratory, get organic carbon tests, use the bulk density calculations, etc. But when you start to think this through, what are we trying to do here? We're going out to a big 100, 200, 300 500 hectare paddock. We're taking little bits of soil here, there, all over the place. We're subsampling it, and we're using that little sample to infer how many tonnes of carbon there is in that big paddock with all the diversity that we know that exists, the heterogeneity that exists. So it's when a whole lot of statistics and comes into it in terms of how we sample and how much we sample, and to get a good, and what's the variance, to understand the variance, to get a good representative number. That starts to cost money, that starts to build up, and that becomes a barrier. So now we're looking at alternative approaches. We're looking at the use of sensing, both proximal sensing nearby and remote sensing through drones, satellites, etc. And we're looking at modelling to how we can take models to estimate and infer based on practices about what the soil carbon is in different soil types. And the Australian government's put a lot of money, a lot of investment into developing these different methodologies to become more rigorous and plausible. There's this, through the previous Australian government, that famous target of reducing the cost to $3 per hectare, of reducing the cost of measuring soil carbon to $3 per hectare. My response to that is, that's easy, just take one sample per 100 hectares. Because the inference being there's no actual qualification about the accuracy that you want there. So let's say there is an assumption that you want it to be reasonably accurate for the purposes of this exercise. The other point that sometimes comes up confusion, that we're sometimes talking dollars and pounds, but you know, from an agronomic and from a soils perspective, we talk about tonnes of carbon. But when we start talking about carbon trading and the like, we start talking about carbon dioxide equivalents. And so just on that sort of mass balance, recognise that 1 tonne of carbon is actually 3.67 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So when people start having a conversation with you about sequestering X number of tonnes of carbon, etc., just check that you're talking the same language to each other. It can make a difference. Just a couple of points about marketing and monetising soil carbon, but this is a whole afternoon, a whole week in itself, and I don't want to go there. But just to recognise for those, there's some people here who are right in this space and know so much about it, more than I do, and I'm a scientist and I don't want to know more about it than what I currently do. But recognising, you know, we've set up a system around carbon credits, essentially a transferable financial instrument based on a tonne of CO2 equivalent reduction in greenhouse gases, or an increase in soil carbon or tree carbon sequestration. And so the Australian government, through their programs, recognises that as an ACU, Australian Carbon Credit Unit, and we start trading ACUs, etc. And they can be traded, and we talk about carbon offsets, and companies are buying those ACUs to offset their emissions elsewhere, to reduce their hard to abate greenhouse gas emissions. We also talk about carbon insets, and that's where a business can use their own carbon sequestration to reduce their own net greenhouse gas emissions. And you can imagine that being quite applicable in an agricultural context where a farming business does have an emission which is hard to abate, but being able to, at a farm level at least, being able to claim those insets as against their own emissions. So I want to talk a bit more now about making and maintaining soil organic carbon. So essentially what we have in our soil is that balance of inputs and outputs. Always, every day, of the year at different rates, our soil carbon there's inputs and outputs. We've got those gains and additions less the outputs for losses and decomposition. So essentially to sequester carbon, we need to strip it all back. How do we increase the rate of input and or at the same time decrease the rate of decomposition or loss? And then bring it back to that cash or bank balance type scenario. How do you increase your income? How do you decrease your rate of expenditure? That's how you start making money. I do want to do that. So let's just look at the how we increase the rate of input. Essentially, how you increase the product of photosynthesis for net primary productivity. Whatever way is talked about, essentially what we're talking about is in situ, how we increase biomass production. There's various ways we can do it. Removing constraints to growth. So these are some of the basic practices of good agricultural, good farming practice. Addressing issues like pH, acidity, low fertility, compaction. How we might extend the growing season. So you've got inputs occurring for longer. The use of perennials in the growing system, the use of cover crops or double cropping to utilise those periods when you're not traditionally growing a crop. And I recognise and acknowledge that, especially those couple of points can be very difficult in a rain-fed constrained system such as what we have in Western Australia. How we increase diversity, the use of pasture phases, back to the old pastoralists system, crop pasture rotations, taking advantages of niches both in time and looking at seasonal differences and what species do well at different times of the year, and in place and what species do well in different parts of the soil and landscape. But also in the same place and at the same time looking at cover cropping, intercropping, multi-species pastures, looking at deep-rooted pastures that put carbon deeper into the soil. So these are all things that are talked about in a whole range of forums around how we might increase soil carbon, how we might improve our soil health. It's also the ex situ, how we bring carbon from off-site into that soil system, importing organic biomass around compost, mulches, biochar, biosolids, manures. Also at the same time decreasing the rate of loss, reducing tillage, reducing cultivation, retaining stubble being some of the more obvious ones. Reducing bare soil, maintaining vegetative cover. One, so you're not losing it by erosion, and two, you're reducing those temperature extremes that impact upon what's going on. Increasing clay content, delving, bringing clay into the soil, which helps to retain soil carbon. The use, which we're starting to see now, of microbial inoculants that might have a role here in helping to decrease, to essentially capture and move that soil carbon into more resilient or stable pools of carbon. So there's opportunities for increasing soil carbon, but not everywhere. There are limits to how much carbon can be stored in the system. That's governed by soil type, by texture, by climate. And some farming systems, soil carbon, organic carbon is reaching its attainable storage limits. This is not something that you can keep increasing forever. It does level off, but that level off period is going to vary with different soil types, etc. So the opportunities for sequestration are less in sandy soils as opposed to clay soils as a generalisation, and in lower rainfall areas. Tropical soils, not that we have them here, but northern parts of Western Australia, often have high inputs but also have high rates of loss too. Whilst it can grow quickly with the temperature and moisture, it can quickly decompose and disappear. In many farming systems, we already have large-scale adoption of good farming practices of no tillage, of stubble retention, crop rotation, soil amelioration. And I dare say Australia, and in particular Western Australia, has led the world in adoption of no-till over the last 30 years. So that adoption is already high. We're already doing this, but soil organic carbon levels haven't increased significantly. So we need to go beyond what we're doing there. Also need to be aware that increasing soil carbon sequestration might have unintended consequences. I spoke earlier, we're not just talking about soil carbon, we're talking about organic matter. So every tonne of carbon is stored, we're also tying up nitrogen, phosphorus, sulphur, potassium. If yields are to be maintained, this extra fertiliser requirement needs to be factored in. If you're looking to bring more pastures into the rotation, well, you've got pastures, great. What are you going to do with those pastures? You're going to use livestock to graze them. There's increased, back to that story earlier, increased nitrous oxide, increased methane emissions. So all these emissions then need to be considered in a whole of system or life cycle analysis context. Yes, we're sequestering carbon, but are we increasing emissions elsewhere in our system? If we are going this pathway, and especially if we're looking to monetise the market, there's issues to consider. Permanence. The concept of someone getting paid for the soil carbon that's sequestered, but then all that soil carbon just being released to the atmosphere next year or year after doesn't cut the mustard. What the markets are looking for and what the governments are looking for is a commitment to ensuring that carbon stays there for a long time. In practical terms, we're talking at least 25 years, and there's other systems where it's about 100 years. So what happens when a drought comes along? And in a drought, you're losing you're decreasing those inputs, and you're losing carbon in many places. Now this can be factored for in the various agreements and contracts that are put in there, but there's a risk about, so who's responsible if you sold that carbon and that carbon's not there anymore? What about when economics change? And yeah, it was a good idea going to pastures, but the bottom's fallen out of livestock and etc. And I need to go back into cropping, and my soil carbon's going to disappear there. But hey, I've sold my soil carbon. Who pays then? And I'm selling my farm. And hey, you can buy my farm, you can buy the soil, but the carbon in that soil, I've already sold it to Microsoft or Wesfarmers. That's not your carbon. I can't sell it to you. And you've got to make sure it's still there in 20 years' time. These are things that we need to consider as we're going in these pathways. There's this concept of additionality, but much what we're talking about sequestering carbon is good farming practice, and many farmers are doing it already and have started to achieve those higher levels in some places. If they're already doing that, why do they need to be incentivised or rewarded for something that they're already doing as far as good farming practice? I'm not giving you the answer, I'm saying these are some of the policy issues that have come up there. Also, considering those non-CO2 emissions around fertilisers and livestock. Yeah, this concept of double counting, whose carbon is it? If you've sold the carbon, you can't then use it to offset your own emissions because someone else is counting it in their balance sheet to offset their emissions. So be cautious of that. What you might be able to say, you've got a good-looking farm, and hey, you're still getting all those soil benefits of soil organic matter. You're still getting the benefit of that soil structure, water holding capacity, etc. But you just can't count that carbon in your balance sheet anymore. But the time to impact. What we know about soil carbon is that it changes slowly in the soil, and before that variability around how we measure it, the time taken to see a significant difference when it is increasing can be at least 10 years. I remember talking about this to a banker, one of the big banks, who came from a financial background. I didn't know anything about soil carbon. I was getting pretty excited about using soil carbon as an indicator for a whole range of reasons. He was asking me, so how much is soil carbon going to change on a quarterly basis? And so I sort of take a step back and take them through some of this, but it's not like your financial reports and the like. This will be a 10-year plus type story if that variation does exist. And I'll touch upon the issues of measurement and verification. So research challenges remain. How do we increase soil organic carbon levels reliably, consistently, profitably in different farming systems, in different environments and soil types? How do we integrate those new practices into our farming systems? The use of cover crops, plant diversity, biological stimulants and inoculants. How do we manage that nutrient tie-up story? The concept of integrated soil fertility management, both the synthetic or inorganic and the organic nutrient supplies. How do we agronomically and economically best use external sources of organic carbon, the biochar, the biosolids, compost, effluents, manures, mulches? At the Soil CRC and elsewhere, we are looking at these questions and we're addressing them. The Western Australian Government has a program, the Carbon Farming and Land Restoration Program, $15 million over 4 years under the West Australian climate policy, supporting the growth of the West Australian carbon market, and many of you here will know about this and know a lot more about it than I do. Looking to deliver priority co-benefits, recognising, yes, it's about carbon and carbon farming, but it's also about how do we achieve salinity mitigation, soil health, agricultural productivity, Aboriginal economic and cultural outcomes. So there's 15 carbon farming projects in place, including 8 soil and 7 reforestation projects, and there's 4 research or future carbon projects, research grants for pilots and trials to develop new carbon emission reduction methodologies. We've got a project in that with the West Australian Government. Just a bit more detail about that. So we've got a project where we're looking at a range of treatments, looking at how we increase carbon biomass with continuous inputs, plant-based solutions, looking at how we increase the buffering capacity of the soil by increasing clay content, by soil amelioration and bringing clay up from lower levels from subsoil, looking at how we might slow down microbial breakdown, increase stabilisation of carbon through amendments and biochar, and increasing carbon through organic amendments, manures and frass. And this is a photo I took yesterday. In fact, I went for a field trip up to the West Midlands group in Dandaragan, where we've got a trial. Beautiful day up there yesterday. Ceradella, that is, it's growing. It's had a couple of years of wheat, a couple of years of Ceradella. They'll go back into wheat in future years. So we've got 4 field trials, a project led by West Australian No-Till Farming with Murdoch University, and our grower group partners here in Western Australia with Facey Group, with Courage and Farm Improvement Group, with West Midlands Group, with Levy Group. So, it's starting to finish up, but there's potentially many win-wins from the carbon side of things. So increased soil carbon leads to increased soil organic matter, improved soil health, which leads to increased soil productivity, which leads to increased farming productivity, which leads to increased financial and environmental sustainability. Now, the degree of correlation and causality between each of those steps varies in different parts of the landscape, different parts of the country. And I could show you a graph on this one and a graph on that one, but as general principles, this holds true. And so those win-wins, what's good for the soil is good for the business, and it's also good for the planet in terms of helping to draw down atmospheric carbon. So that's why we're saying it makes sense. Look at how we can do it in your own farming systems. So, what to do? Now, this is sort of pitched a bit more towards farmers in the audience when I'm talking to those audiences. I urge them to continue to focus on the main game, growing a crop, raising livestock. Don't get carried away by, hey, I'm going to go carbon farming now. Your main source of income is still going to be your staples. To adopt a sustainable soil health management practice that maintains and increases soil carbon. So good agricultural practice, good soil management practice. Measure and monitor your soil health, a range of indicators including soil carbon. It can be expensive, but I suggest you do start to baseline your soil carbon now. Set yourself up for the future, whatever pathway we might go down. Be cautious if selling your soil carbon. There's opportunities here. There's opportunities to realistically, and not to undersell it, to develop an alternative income stream. So long as you've asked the right questions, you've covered your risks appropriately, you understand what you're entering into. There can be benefits here. But also to consider using your soil carbon sequestration as insets against your own emissions. But collectively, at the end of the day, aim for sustainable carbon neutral crop and livestock production. Your markets are going to be asking for it. If not now, the day's going to come both domestically and internationally, when they'll be asking you to be able to tell us what your carbon footprint is and tell us what you're doing to reduce your carbon footprint. And if you can't do that, they'll go elsewhere to buy, and we're already starting to see that happen. So that's why that's important. I'm going to leave with a bit of a philosophical question. But if a tonne of carbon gets sequestered and no one's there to measure it and no one's there to make money out of it, does it make a difference? And my answer to that is yes, it does. So, and maybe not a tonne, but scale it up, megatonne, gigatonne, etc. every bit does make a difference. The atmosphere isn't seeing accus. The atmosphere isn't seeing what Microsoft is buying on the markets in Chicago or anything like that. The atmosphere is seeing how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. So every tonne of CO2 we can avoid from putting up there is making a difference. It's also making a difference to your soil and to your farming system as well. So that's how I'm going to finish it. There's a lot more about what the Soil CRC does. You can follow us on the various socials, etc., and you can follow up with me by email. So thank you very much, Terry. We'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that very informative opening address. And I think you raised the issues, put them on the table, and as you've said, you didn't propose to answer all the questions, but we've certainly put everything out there to think about. And we'll. Sorry, did you have a question? Yes. We're going to hold questions. We're going to have a panel session afterwards, so please, Michael will be available then. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions that could come from that. So thank you very much. I think that set the scene very well. Well, now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, somebody who I've worked closely with over a number of years, Professor Ross Kingwell. Ross this year was awarded the GRDC Seed of Light Award, an award presented by GRDC to those who have contributed significantly to putting the message of agriculture and research to the wider community. So congratulations, Ross, on receiving that award this year. But Ross is a respected agricultural economist. He's authored more than 145 journal articles and book chapters and more than 320 conference papers and policy reports. A lot of work there, Ross. He is a professor of the School of Agriculture and Environment at the University of Western Australia, chief economist at the Australian the Australian Export Grains and Innovation Centre, and co-leader of a small group of economists in the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. Ross has chaired the Australian Farm Institute's Research Advisory Committee and been a co-editor of the Australian Journal of Agriculture and Resource Economics. He is a former president and now Distinguished Fellow of the Australian Agriculture and Research Economics Society. So with a wonderful background in all matters agriculture and the economics of it, would you please welcome Professor Kingwell.
So the challenge ahead for West Australian agriculture is that emissions from West Australian agriculture are projected to increase in coming years. So the challenge is growing. And the nature of that increase in emissions is also interesting because the composition of those emissions is changing, which means there's different challenges in different industries. Let's put agriculture in its widest state context. At a state level, that squiggly black line across the top is the state emissions. And you'll see that they, in the last decade or so, have largely plateaued. But the principal source of emissions emanating from Western Australia come from the energy sector. And it's interesting that Minister Whitby now has, since December, also been given energy in his portfolio. What is the focus of today's talk are the emissions from agriculture, and as Michael has just intimated, that needs to be complemented by the role of agriculture as a source of sequestration services. In reporting emissions, what tends to happen is that they are split into different sectors or industries, and there's one group, one industry known as the land use change and forestry sector, which is the principal provider of sequestration sources. And that sector, I think, needs to be bundled in with agriculture for some reasons that I'll explore shortly. If you look at the projection for emissions from Western Australian agriculture, what you find is the projections for the beef, dairy, cattle industry are for those emission levels to be essentially maintained. So people are not looking at an explosion in beef cattle numbers or dairy cattle numbers in Western Australia. There is a diminution of the state's sheep flock, and I'll talk more about that shortly. But the big growth of emissions comes via cropping. So the challenge of reducing emissions is a challenge that is shifting more towards cropping industries. If I was to give this talk a decade ago, the clear emphasis would have been on those belching, farting ruminants, those evil cows and sheep. That's certainly not the prospective vision. Sheep numbers have been for some time on a downwards trajectory. And that trajectory, in light of the likely cessation of the live sheep trade, is sending economic signals back into the sheep industry that is not rewarding sheep production. And many farmers are making adjustment decisions to shift further into cropping. So the current situation is that you will have to go back 3 generations of farmers until you find the same size of sheep flock that is about to unfold this year and next year. If you look at the most recent May sheep producer intentions, those intentions reveal that those producers are going to be moving strongly out of sheep production. And these are not, if you like, attitudinal sentiments. These are being expressed more broadly, because if you talk to any input suppliers to the sheep industry, they will say that's exactly what they're beginning to observe on the ground. So by the end of this year and heading into next year, our sheep population is going to be a third of what it was 3 or 4 decades ago. But grains, a different story. This is a point that Minister Whitby made, is that when it comes to grains industries, despite the evident gradual decline in growing season rainfall that is observed in many agricultural locations across our state, if that was the only factor driving crop yields, then you would expect to observe a gradual decline in grain yields across the state, our agriculture being rain-fed. But despite that more adverse environment in which grain production is taking place, we are fortunate to observe a fairly consistent upward trajectory in grain yields. And that's due to ongoing investments in science, technology, engineering and farm management. So if you were to multiply that yield gain by the number of hectares, by the farm gate price of grains, what you would find is that currently there are billions of dollars of revenue being poured into the state economy each year, thanks to the historic investments in science, technology, engineering and farm management. And that's a story often worth repeating to politicians, that investment in agricultural R&D delivers some ongoing, very long-lived returns. And it shows up with an upward trajectory in grain exports. One of the fortunate things of being a state with a small population and a large agricultural area is that we have the capacity to produce surplus to our domestic needs. So we are able to export each year billions of dollars, millions of metric tonnes of grain to overseas consumers, and those revenues flow back into the state economy. And that upward trajectory for the grains industry, with the associated upward trajectory of emissions, is being supported by an increasing global demand for grains and oilseeds. There are lots of end uses of grains. Most of the meat consumed in countries to our north, pork, chicken, fish, is underpinned by grain feeding. They need to purchase millions and millions of tonnes of feed grains into those countries to support their dietary behaviour. And meat eating is an increasing feature as per capita wealth grows. As nations become more populous, then again the sheer weight of an increasing number of mouths means there's an increasing demand for grain and grain products. So more people, richer people, is a good news story for agricultural production. This is just a chart that shows that as a suite of data. On the vertical axis is per capita expenditure on food and non-alcoholic beverages. Across the horizontal axis is per capita GDP. There's 188 countries in this chart. And when you plot them, it's pretty clear that the richer the population is in a country, the more they spend on food. If you look at just the regional increases in animal protein consumption towards 2050, and this is based on an FAO report from last year, in Asia alone over the next 3 decades, their increase in animal protein consumption is going to be 6.37 million metric tonnes of animal protein. And if you just use a simple conversion ratio that to produce a kilogram of animal protein is going to require somewhere between 2.5 to 4 kilograms of feed grains, that means in Asia alone, they are going to need between 16 million metric tonnes and 25 million metric tonnes of feed grains just to satisfy their animal protein consumption requirements. Remember that in Western Australia, we produce around about 15 million metric tonnes of grain on average each year. So the entire grain production from Western Australia would be needed to just begin to put an inroad in that demand for feed grain, for animal protein. And the Minister mentioned that already one of the merits of West Australian agriculture from an emissions perspective is that we are able to produce some of our grains in which the emissions intensity is very low. And WA canola is such an example. We are one of the few regions in the world that consistently are able to produce canola in which are embedded low emissions relative to many other canola exporters. And that gives us preferential market access to the European Union and price premiums. So, emissions from cropping are projected to perhaps eventually in Western Australia to become just as important as livestock emissions. And it's important also to understand there are different categories of emissions. There are emissions generated on the farm, they're known as Scope 1. There are emissions that come from the production of purchased electricity, so coal-fired, gas-powered electricity has emissions associated with its production. Whenever you purchase that electricity, you are indirectly purchasing those emissions. And then there's Scope 3, which are emissions generated in the production of inputs such as herbicides, fertilisers, fuels. And these are those categories of emissions. And again, if you look out to 2035, yes, it's true that on-farm emissions remain the principal source of emissions in Western Australian agriculture, but keep your eye on Scope 3. It's the emissions embedded in the inputs that are purchased by... Sure. It's the emissions that are embedded in the inputs used in cropping and livestock that are increasingly a focus for reduction. So again, if you look at what is the current suite of emissions and you look at the percentage changes in those categories of emissions out to 2035, yes, the first one, enteric fermentation. This is predominantly the methane that is breathed out or farted out by ruminants. That's the principal source of greenhouse gas emissions, but there's also likely to be significant increases via the cropping industries with respect to liming, through the application of nitrogenous fertilisers, through fertiliser manufacture, and through the manufacture of herbicides, fungicides. That leads to the question, if we can't easily abate these emissions, and that is an important if, because I believe that over the next decade, one of the predictable outcomes of R&D and innovation is that there will be ways found to reduce these emissions. So the current estimates may in fact be overestimates when those innovative practices are unveiled over the next 2 decades. But there's obviously going to be some emissions that for a variety of reasons it's just technically or economically not currently feasible to reduce. And so we must turn to offsetting those emissions. And that's where carbon sequestration on agricultural land is destined to play an important role. So what needs to happen to reduce agricultural emissions? There's obviously the need to embrace technological change, both on-farm and pre-farm. There needs to be ways found to produce some of the inputs used by agriculture in which there are fewer emissions embedded. Producing nitrogenous fertiliser in a way in which there are fewer emissions embedded. And then there's the opportunity for carbon sequestration. Now, one way might be via reforestation on low opportunity cost land. So for me, the priorities include reducing enteric methane in animal systems, reducing nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide emissions from some of the main inputs used in cropping, and finding low-cost, reliable, effective sequestration options. And Peter Metcalf will talk about one of those options. And again, I think there are opportunities for innovation. The traditional way of sequestration, where you just reforest a poorly performing paddock, I think eventually is unreliable because of the exposure to fire damage. I think there needs to be smarter, better ways of providing sequestration services that do rely on use of agricultural land, but allow agricultural land to be used in a different way to what we have currently observed for sequestration purposes over the last 2 decades. Right, that's my story.
Thank you very much, Ross. Continuing the opening discussions, I now pleasure in inviting Tony Seabrook to address. And after the 3 speakers, we'll then have a panel session, and following that, then questions. So that's the order of the day. So, look, Tony is the current president of the Pastoralists and Graziers Association of WA. He's having been elected to that position in 2014. Tony's been actively engaged in the PGA and industry politics for over 40 years. He commenced his career farming in York in 1968, having completed education in Perth, and operated at both contract harvesting and earth moving business in conjunction with farming for over 25 years. Over the past 2 decades, Tony has also been heavily involved in an import and retail operation, Ag Imports Proprietary Limited, sourcing large agricultural earth moving and transport equipment from the USA and China. This business is ongoing, and he has required extensive travel throughout China. Tony has been very active in agriculture education, with time spent on the board of UWA Institute of Agriculture. He has a passion for agri-politics. Most of you would have heard him in that role a few times, and for advancing the prosperity of agriculture. Tony continues to live at York and farm their seaborne property with his family, producing wheat, barley, canola, wool, red meat and export hay. He is a vehement opponent of unwanted bureaucratic interferences in industry, and has spent his adult life fighting government over-regulation. Will you please welcome Tony Seabrook.
Thanks, Terry. I suppose you all noticed the high-vis gear I get around in. Michael, your original comment about no, thank you, and your last one, does it matter? Yes, it does. It really does. And Ross, you always bring a very practical aspect to everything you say. You're the farmer's friend, you speak our language, and there's optimism there, but you know, you've been a great stalwart and you're very highly regarded by all of us. Some of the things I was going to say here, Terry's just covered off on that, so I guess I've been 10 years at the head of the PGA. I've been heavily involved in defending my industry, mostly against stupid, punitive government policies, and that's been over 50 years. I'll skip through some of the other stuff I've got here because that's largely been covered. So I cut my teeth in 1962 when my father put me on a harvester. Massey Ferguson 585, he told me, my God, you've no idea how lucky you are. It's got an umbrella on top of it. That umbrella I still own, the harvester I don't. The way that umbrella was set up, occasionally, when a willy-willy came past, it would tear the damn thing out of the piece of pipe right behind my shoulder, and it would go into orbit. I've seen that umbrella 300 feet up in the air. But anyway, today we drive around the place in air-conditioned comfort, and we don't even use the steering wheel much anymore. That's pretty well taken care of as well. So I've been at home. I've done 62 consecutive harvests, haven't missed one. I've got 40,000 hours operating plant, and I've had a great deal of time to think and observe. My industry has gone from one that was listened to, supported and respected, to one that is now under attack from so many quarters, ignored by government, unsupported by the general urban community, and criticised by many who have no understanding or interest in the immense connection and care a farmer has to his land and stock, and we're all totally taken for granted. The concept of freehold title was brutally assaulted by our state government last year through the Aboriginal Cultural and Heritage Act, and for a short while this legislation compelled us to seek permission from traditional owners to carry out basic farming activities such as moving fences, constructing dams or upgrading infrastructure. Wisely, the state government withdrew that legislation. Now we recently have seen passed federal legislation banning a viable export income producing live export industry in spite of the total opposition to this from regional WA. All growers and related organisations across our nation and even the state government opposed the legislation the federal government put forward. These actions reinforce the situation for agriculture that I've just outlined. The assumption of government and community today is that agriculture has a responsibility to pursue net zero. Agriculture, especially live production, seems to have become the villain in the climate change debate. I do not believe that net zero is a primary goal for agriculture. It is essential and is the only means of feeding our nation and sustaining our world and the nation's population. If net zero is possible without limiting production and imposing a cost burden on this industry, it may be achievable in the future. Agriculture is not a wasteful industry, nor is it a highly profitable one. It is lean, smart, innovative and highly efficient. It is able to feed the entire population of Australia with the best food in the world. We also export enough food to overseas countries to feed another 50 million people. Jeopardising this would be most unwise. For your interest, my own farm, with a staff of 3, generates enough produce to feed 10,000 people. In a recent submission to a federal government inquiry into food security, I ended up by saying that the greatest threat to our food security in Australia is actually our government. I would now like to add and reinforce the threat of ill-informed activists and special interest groups pursuing dangerous and unrealistic agendas. Consider the recent Sri Lankan adventure, a nation brought to the brink of collapse by the intervention of well-intentioned idealists. At the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa gave a speech bragging about his country's move towards sustainable agriculture. I would imagine to the great applause of many there. This included a ban on chemical fertilisers and pesticides, all to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Less than a year later, thousands of Sri Lankans faced starvation and the government toppled. This crisis was not unavoidable and shows 2 important lessons for Australia. First, the importance of protecting free and open government and economic liberty, and the second, the dangers of faux environmentalism. Emissions reduction in Australia, whilst an admirable target, will have very small effect on the world climate. There is little we can do in this country that will have a meaningful impact on the Great Barrier Reef or rising sea levels in the Pacific. To say that we need to act to send a message to the rest of the world is dangerous virtue signalling and will achieve little. It may also bring a smile to the face of our competitors. Maybe we could stop exporting coal, 335 million tonnes of it. But with 8 billion tonnes of coal being mined and burnt every year, globally, it would be hugely financially detrimental to Australia and provide no benefit to the global situation. Coal exports generate $127 billion worth of export income to Australia. This money is fundamental in underpinning our standard of living. As you can see from this graph, China, India and the United States contribute over 42% of greenhouse gases. Australia, 1.3. So now to the title of today's address. Let us break it down into two separate activities, growing crops and livestock enterprises. Cropping first. I understand that of the 7.7 billion litres of fuel imported into Western Australia annually, transport consumes 41%, mining 38%, and agriculture a mere 7%. In this situation, electric tractors and harvesters are unlikely to make much of an impact, even assuming that the electricity used is totally green and that they're actually up to doing the job. Nitrogenous fertilisers are very expensive, but absolutely necessary. We measure our use very carefully, trying always to apply just before rain. Lost nitrogen to the atmosphere is a very expensive cost. Not applying nitrogen in a high-intensity system renders our farms unprofitable. Australia has very old and deficient soils. All the other so-called fertilisers, apart from nitrogen, are to compensate for what our ancient soils lack and to replace what goes out the gate in the grain. We measure this every year and we try and replace what we take away. The last thing we need is government and bureaucratic intervention and mandates. As a new technology matures and becomes competitive, we will quickly adopt it. As Ross said earlier on, knife points, minimum till, auto steer, classic examples of this happening. GM crops are one of the big opportunities as we move forward. Unfortunately, we can expect the usual activists to continue to block this exciting advance. With the same labour inputs or less, production off a typical farm has increased in my lifetime tenfold and will undoubtedly continue to increase. Measured winter rainfall, as Ross said, in the WA wheat belt has fallen by approximately 20% in the last 60 years. And yet, yield in kilograms per millimetre of rainfall is increasing as we adapt to changes over which we have no control. So now to livestock and their emissions. Already we continue to see calls for radical, widespread changes in what we eat, pushing for the drastic reduction, if not elimination, of animal source foods from our diets. As every farmer knows, not all grain and meat is the same. Extensive, often mobile pastoral systems of the sort commonly seen across northern Australia have hugely different effects compared to contained, intensive industrial livestock production found in Europe, Asia and North America. WA pastoralists and farmers manage livestock across an area larger than Western Europe. Our cattle herd size is 2 million head. In the EU, 76 million head. In Brazil, 238 million head. 2 million in Western Australia. So please consider whether it be a sheep eating grass, growing wool, or producing a lamb or a beast eating grass and producing milk, or grazing herbage in the rangelands and producing meat. They are converting something inedible to humans into a product both desirable, beneficial, natural, and in great demand worldwide. There are issues around feedlot emissions, and I'm told that animals in that environment and with that diet perform differently to grass-fed, free-range animals. Asparagopsis additives are proving to be a solution to this issue. Either way, people like eating meat, and science is yet to come up with an acceptable alternative. What they don't talk about is the fact that the relationship between livestock and the environment is more complex than promoted by the media. At the same time, this can be said for cropping operations. So now it gets interesting. What I would like to propose for you, for your consideration, is this. Now that's a one-shot, one day. Half the world was asleep when that was taken. The centre bit in where Europe is was 4 o'clock in the morning. So you can look this up anywhere you like. This is what's actually going on. And this is why I get a bit jumpy about us in agriculture being told to lift our game. That versus this. These are sheep grazing a pasture we can't eat, turning that pasture into something we would very much like to eat. This one is a ripper. That ship takes over 6,000 people on a journey to nowhere. I've seen photographs of these ships cruising. Now there is a mandated fuel they're supposed to use. I don't know how well it's policed. If my truck chuffed out as much smoke as I've seen some of these things doing, I'd take it to the doctor straight away. So, a journey to nowhere. There's over 300 of these cruise ships going nowhere in the world today. I put this down not as a need, I put this down as an absolute want. Once again. Do we call that a need or a want? That is a need. They're growing wool, they're turning something you can't eat into something you'd like to eat. Very benign. As Ross said earlier on, we are in serious trouble. 38 million sheep in the early 1990s, down to probably 8 or 9, possibly 10 now, and going the wrong way. Livestock are a very integral part of what we need to do in the mixed cropping system. And to see what's unfolding right now, to those of us that have been in the trade for a long time, it's a grave concern. Once again, nighttime, a football match at nighttime, 60,000 people carted to a football match on highly subsidised transport to watch a game they could watch on television at home. The energy consumed there at night time is absolutely huge, but I'm told it's far surpassed by the amount of energy used to keep the grass in the right sort of shape. Now, there have been occasions we've had sporting games over here where up to 15,000 people have come across from the eastern states to watch the football. At 300 people per aeroplane, that's 45 plane loads of people coming over here for a need or a want. 70 tonnes of aviation fuel on those aeroplanes to do that, brought over here and taken away. What I'm trying to say here is I don't have a problem with that, but let's get the perspective here right and work out where the problem actually lies. That is a need. That is a really serious need. That canola oil, it could be used, subsidised, or be transposed into a fuel we can burn. It can be used for cooking with. It can be used in a feed ration. That is a need. This one? I don't know. They don't actually burn that much fuel when they're racing. It's the flying of the darn things around the world that's the problem. But our society is happy with this. But agriculture must lift its game. That is agriculture. That is what I do. And when I say our little farm produces enough food to feed 10,000 people, I am being conservative, but the diet might be a lot of bread, a bit of canola oil to dip the bread into, but you will be well fed. It'll be good bread. Now that one, we're off to Europe. Whoopie-doo. 320,000 litres of fuel in that aeroplane. That's a lot of fuel. And how many people on that plane need to be there, and how many people just want to be there? This is what we do in the rangelands. Debbie Dowden will be speaking later on today. This is what they do. They run cattle in an environment where we can't do anything else with that land, and they produce a product that is in great demand. And that young bloke, that's me. So look, in concluding, what I'd like to say is that the farm that I'm in now, my grandchildren will be the 7th generation on that farm. There's so little recognition of the bond that a farmer has with his land. Put him under economic pressure and he might start doing things he doesn't want to do but needs to do. But you must make absolutely certain that you don't put him under the sort of pressure that will see land degradation occur. My farm, I know every inch of it. I've ridden over it so many times I could hardly count. The condition of the soils, the condition of that farm now has absolutely never been better than it currently is, by any measure. Soil carbons, we've replaced so many of the nutrient deficiencies that are there. And I wasn't going to say this, I believe I might even be carbon neutral. We've been planting trees on our farm since the early 1950s. But I haven't been planting them to be carbon neutral, I just kind of like trees. There's an old fellow called Norm Lockyer who mentored me a great deal when I was much younger. He said things to me I didn't quite understand that much at the time. But one of the things that have absolutely stuck with me, and Norm's been dead for probably 40 years, but he said, Tony, live your life as you're going to die tomorrow. but farm as though you're going to live for 100 years. And I think that's some of the wisest pieces of advice anyone could have ever given me. So I'll finish up by saying, climbing on a bandwagon is easy to do, whether you're committed to the argument around climate change or not. We live in a time when people are too often looking for an opportunity to virtue signal. The simple fact that food is essential cannot be ignored or undervalued. The banning of live export is a classic case of this. It has denied nations that were dependent upon us access to food. It has also cost the West Australian community and West Australian regional and communities hugely for absolutely no benefit to anybody. The blind adherence to renewables is not as simple as it seems. The East Coast appears to now need 24 gas-fired power plants to keep the lights on. We will need baseload power, and if not coal, it may need to be nuclear. So the last few things I'll say, be very careful what you visit on the agricultural industry, for it is we that feed you, and that food is a need, not a want. And remember once again what happened to Sri Lanka when the wrong people took charge of the farm. If net zero is to be achieved for agriculture, it is essential the scientific and general communities work with us, not against us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Well, that completes the presentations. We're now going to move to a panel session. So I'd like to invite Debbie Dowden, Peter Metcalf, Rebecca Kelly, Richard Brake to, do they take their seats up here? Okay, so while that's while they're coming up there, I'd like to introduce the moderator who is going to conduct the panel. Rob Grimmer. So Rob was a UWA graduate. He brings to planned farming an enviable professional industry spanning more than 20 years. Beginning as a research economist with the Department of Agriculture, Rob later took on the role of almost a decade as an agronomist with Elders before reverting to economic research, where he specialised in the economics of crop protection, innovation and livestock management. Today, Rob is well known in the industry, particularly in the Northern Agricultural region, with clients right across the Geraldton zone. He applies his unique experience to partner with clients to deliver the outstanding results, service and support. Rob, the podium's now yours, so I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we'll come back to questions at the end of this.
That's great. Thanks, Terry. This thing's on, obviously. Thank you for having me. Welcome to the panel session of today. I'm not going to stand up there. I'm going to sit down here with my friends, most of which I know. Debbie, hello. We have spoken. Topic today, as you've heard, a lot of people talking about, can agriculture reach net zero? An incredibly difficult topic. As you just heard, I am a graduate of this university. I've been in the industry for more than 30 years, actually, as one of my fellow graduates found out today. I've been plying my trade for 30 years in this industry, and every day I help my clients either try and make decisions or try and manage the change after making the decision, and then monitoring and evaluating the impact on their business. And when it comes to topics, there's no more difficult one than this one. Succession, piece of cake compared to this. So today we have, we're all moulded by our experiences, of course, and today we've heard a lot from some learned, very intelligent people. We've got 4 people here that are going to talk about their experiences, and it's incredibly nourishing to, once I've spoken to all of them, they've got different angles to tell because they're all moulded by their experience, but they've got quite a similar story to tell despite the different angles, which is encouraging. And it's incredibly difficult to tell your story in the time frame that we've been allocated today. So I've actually decided to do a one-on-one individually with each of them for 10 or 15 minutes or whatever it is, to hopefully help them get their story across, rather than just ask a question and then see where it goes, because that could end up anywhere, which is fine. But none of them have agreed. We've got a script, but none of them have agreed to stick to that, so we'll just see how we go. So I'm going to introduce them one at a time and ask them to introduce themselves effectively. And I'm not going to take any longer, and we're going to start right now. So firstly, I want to talk with Rebecca. Rebecca Kelly, farms at Minginoo, landowner and business owner. Rebecca, could you please describe your business and what your role is?
Hi everyone. Yes, so I farm at Minginoo. It's 400 k's north of Perth. It's got a rainfall of about 400 mil, so not that high, but not the lowest either. I farm wheat, canola, lupins and pasture as well. We don't have any livestock. I use the pasture just for soil health. But I'm doing that at the moment. I wear a few different hats. A lot of my role is outside as a production based, but then I'm also in the office as well. I do the HR and admin side as well.
Wonderful. And I mean, net zero, climate change, global warming, changing seasons. Can you describe to the crowd the difference between this year and last year in your location?
Yeah, my location, last year for the year I had 207 mil for the entire year. This year in June alone I had 123 mil. I think I'm up to about 170 at the moment, so it is looking a lot better. Yeah, the crops are looking great, and all of the comments before about urea being one of the contributors is unfortunately what we're doing at the moment. We're spreading a lot of urea and hoping for a good yield at the end of the year.
Yeah, that's right. So let's understand that. Average rainfall of 400 mils, 200 mils last year, and what did you say?
This year I'm up to 168.5, but I've got more coming tonight.
That's right. So when I spoke with Beck to start with about what we're going to talk about today, she said, I'm not quite sure why I'm here. I think it's because you just recently did a Nuffield Scholarship. So not many people would, and the Nuffield Scholarship is not on carbon or net zero or anything like that. So could you just describe to the crowd what you actually studied?
Yeah, so I've been quite nervous about sitting in this room. I look at everyone else sitting here and I think that there's probably 99% of you that are more knowledgeable in this area than I am. But I'm a farmer, so I can talk about that side of things. I've done a Nuffield Scholarship, or I'm doing it at the moment, and my topic was energy and agriculture and where they intersect. So I was looking at when someone wants to come onto your farm, wind, solar, oil or gas, what are your rights as farmers and what should your contracts look like? The background for this, and this sounds even more controversial, is that I have gas rigs on my farm in Minginoo. We've got quite a lot of gas, and it is, I know that we're talking about net zero and we're all looking to go towards renewables. I don't actually have a choice legally whether I have the gas rigs or not. So that was the premises of my topic, and I've looked into renewables as well. There's a push to get to 83% renewables by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And so I figured if I've got the opportunity to look at it now, I can look at what my contract should look like. Should wind approach me in the future, or should solar approach me?
Yeah. Yes, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Beck. And you also bravely told me that you don't know much about carbon, even on your own farm, which is quite brave to come here given that admission. But what we then went on to discuss was the fact that you actually, through not only your own networks within Western Australia, which are vast, but also through the Nuffield process, your networks internationally connect you with a lot of people. And obviously discussions around climate change, etc., were first and foremost in many of those instances. And you had a lot of experiences and stories to share with me. So I'll ask you the question, is net zero possible for agriculture? And what have you learned from your colleagues around the world?
I feel like I should have brought some notes up here. This is different to the questions we talked about on the phone. Is it possible? I'm going against you. I'm sorry, Dr. Michael, but I think practically, yes, it is possible. Will it happen? Hypothetically, probably not. It's for agriculture, sorry. I think there is a lot of things that we can do and that we should be doing to better the environment. I don't think people are questioning whether we should be doing things to better the environment. I think there are a lot of questions which Tony brought up about production reduction and how that is going to look, and what's going to be the biggest benefit. Are we wanting to feed the world, or are we wanting to be net zero as quickly as possible? I think there's a pathway, but it comes with a lot of questions, and talking to a lot of other farmers around both internationally and in Australia, there's too many questions at the moment for the farmers to make their choice. I think the biggest question that comes up is, what are the risks? What are the losses? What are the gains? Do we want to do it initially? It's a bigger topic than just saying yes or no.
No, correct. I agree with you entirely. But you've certainly come across people that have achieved net zero. Can you just describe farmers, producers, etc.? Can you just describe some of those examples that you described to me?
Yes, so part of my Nuffield, we went to, I got the chance to go to about 12 different countries. Ireland was one of them, and it was really interesting looking at agriculture in Ireland versus agriculture in Australia. There seemed to be in Australia a push for profit margins, and in Ireland it seemed to be a little bit more nature-based. When we're looking at emissions, and it was highlighted on Dr. Michael's slides before, Australia is looking at having a 43% reduction from 2005 to 2030. Ireland's looking at a 51% reduction in emissions from 2018 to 2030. So it's a very different level of reductions that we're looking at. Ireland, they've got subsidies. Ireland, I met farmers that can make more money fallowing a paddock than they can actually from growing a crop on that paddock. It's very, in Ireland, in the EU, in the UK in general, it is very people-driven over marketplace-driven. It is seen as a benefit for the people, it's seen as good for the people, and so you're rewarded for doing things for emission reduction. Whereas in Australia, it seems like you're penalised for not doing it.
So a socialist attitude versus a capitalist attitude, is that what you're saying? Or you're just acknowledging the fact that it's an issue for the community, and in Europe, the view is that it's an issue for the community, and
yes,
therefore the community is willing to fund the transition?
Yes, definitely.
Interesting. Do you have a net zero target in your business?
At this stage, no.
No.
It's not been something that we've got a plan going forward to be net zero. Well, it hasn't come up with my chats with my farm consultant, which is actually Rob as well. We're definitely baselining the farm. We do a lot for the farm. We look after our soil health. In my town, there is natural vegetation is generally around about the 3% mark. My farm is 18%. I try as hard as I can. But do I have a plan going forward? Is it something that I talk about at the start of my year with my January meetings? It hasn't been yet, but it quite potentially will be going forward.
Oh, I can't wait for that. That's going to be difficult. Because I'm not sure what my answer would be. I've got one last question for you. I mean, you have networked with a lot of people. You've got a lot of examples of peers that have they've got their own view, etc. They either have or haven't tried to be net zero in their production system. They've come across problems or they've found benefits. Can you just broadly describe any individual cases or a theme that you've heard in terms of those problems that they've encountered on their pathway to become net zero?
Yes, I think the issues that people are facing at this stage, it's very, very paperwork heavy. There's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy, and it is not a farmer's strong point. Well, you're having to wear so many different hats, but it's just yet another hat that we have to wear. So I think it's paperwork heavy at this stage, which is an issue. And I think the other issue that comes up all the time for farmers is that comment, you can't be green if you're in the red. We have to know that it is profitable for us to do it that way. There's no point in looking down that line if we're not going to be able to make money and have jobs at the end of it.
Hear, hear. I agree completely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you. I'm going to move on. Ex-victim, Richard Brake, who was a consultant. I've known Richard for quite some time now. Richard, can you please describe to the audience your role, your business?
What I do?
What do you do every day,
I'm
mate?
the same as you, Rob. I'm an agribusiness consultant. I consult across the pastoral, broadacre and horticultural space, from sort of cash flow management, business management, succession, as Rob touched on, and also in the carbon space as well. I've been carbon accounting for a long time now, and the impact that has on farm businesses. That's I do also carbon project feasibility work with clients, the impact that it's going to have on their business, whether it's going to be profitable for them, the impact that it has on their current enterprises and the profitability of those. And that accounts for probably about 30% of my business.
Yeah, right. Okay. But it started with the accounting, the carbon accounting and measuring for your clients.
In the carbon space?
Yeah, correct.
No,
yeah.
the carbon space started way back, I think one of the speakers said, Michael said 1996, soil carbon sequestration. 1996, I owned a soil testing laboratory in New Zealand, and we were looking at soil microbiological activity at that time. So my journey started there, and interest started there. But really took off in about 2013 when I undertook a MLA project looking at reducing carbon emissions from a prime lamb operation. What we found was that you could reduce the emissions, but it wasn't profitable. You actually made more money from increasing your production and reducing intensity rather than total emissions.
Yeah.
And then built from there and
Brilliant.
started carbon accounting from that point on.
Carbon accounting from that point on.
Yeah.
Okay. So talk to me more about that journey. Because
Carbon
you
accounting?
you had clients, you're trying to convince them of something that wasn't even known.
Yeah,
by
so
many.
I draw a differentiation between carbon baselining, which to me is a carbon project, as Michael alluded to. It is very much a point in time. That's your baseline. And then from a sequestration point of view, you're going to be measured against that. For me, carbon accounting is what is your enterprise, what is your business doing year on year, and how is that changing? How is the seasons influencing that? And what can we do in terms of our management practices to reduce that? So for me, it started out, I wanted to give my clients information. I felt at that time that it was going to become important, and as a consultant, I needed to stay in front of the game and, yeah, really give them the information. So the first place is to understand what we're doing first.
So how did you do that?
How did I do that?
Yep.
I used the PIC calculator, the University of Melbourne calculator,
Yep.
And we as consultants, all of the required information that we need to put into those calculators, we get each year at our annual review. So running that calculator is, in my view, fairly simple. I know that farmers find it difficult from a paperwork numbers point of view. I live for numbers. And out of that, I get an emissions profile, the scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions that have been talked about before. And we can then make a decision around if the client's got an emissions target, how we're going to reduce that, where we need to reduce it. And if not, then we put that in the back pocket and say, we'll look at it again next year. And if a market has come and knocked on our door and said, we will pay you for low emissions, we'll look at the value of that product and what we need to do to reduce those emissions. We'll get to that target and whether it's profitable or not and whether we do it or not.
So to drag your clients along for the journey, it started with just throwing something at them and then educating.
Yeah.
Just educating educating them through that process.
Yeah. And at the moment, my whole client base gets that emissions accounting profile, and I probably have a discussion with about 5% of them about it.
That little, and that needle hasn't moved very much.
It's getting more slowly. They all have an underlying interest in learning about it, understanding it. But as Rebecca said, when you've got a $5 million debt to repay, that really focuses the mind more on getting money in the door than it does reducing your emissions profile.
It's hard to be green when you're in the red.
Yep.
So in terms of the calculators, I mean, you've had a bit of a journey, I know, and you've been involved in many projects, and you've got some pretty strong views about the calculation methodology. Do you want to talk about that?
We had a discussion about that. Yeah, to my mind, they are very simplistic at the moment. They are an ape-based calculator, and they all use a number of different factors, and I can look at 4, 5, 6 different calculators from around the world. They will all give me a completely different number, and which one is right and which one is wrong. And so for me, I firmly believe that in order to improve anything, you've got to be involved in it, you've got to understand it, and you've got to have a number that comes out so you can provide information feedback back to the developers to say, this isn't working for us, this is a problem, we don't believe that factor is right. So yeah, if you're not, in my mind, if you're not using a calculator and you haven't got a number at the end of it and you haven't experienced the pain of going through it, or you haven't understood where that number is, at the end of the day, to me, you only have a view of the calculator. You haven't got anything that you can add to my story or developing that calculator.
Yeah. So you're talking about the difference between some calculators, and some are a black box which you can't understand, and others are open source.
Yep. So the University of Melbourne calculator, to me, it's open source. I can see the factors and calculators that go behind it. There are some online calculators where you cannot see what is effectively under the hood. How have they arrived at the number that you've got in front of you, and what does it mean?
Yeah. And the PIC calculator and other calculators, they're very much an emission-based, largely, but they're not necessarily taking into account the full biology that's occurring.
No.
That would be your view?
I have a big view that we're on a farm, an individual farm basis, but agriculture in generally, we're only accounting for and measuring a small piece of the whole system. To my mind, we operate in a biological system that varies day to day, month to month, year to year, and with a factor that is way beyond our control. So we need to account for the whole process before producers like Rebecca and Debbie are told to reduce their emissions. We need to understand the whole process first before going into it. We can't just select one piece of it and say, we're going to measure you on that, or we're going to regulate you on that. Understand the whole thing.
So more work, more research,
a lot more
data required to go into that tool for you and our producers to have, and the industry at large, to have the confidence.
I'm aware that in the room there's a lot of researchers that have got a lot of knowledge in this space. But the question I'm still getting back at the ground level is, what is carbon? How do I calculate it? And what does it mean to my farm business? They're still at that very basic level. And we're talking about reaching net zero at this point. And as Rebecca said, we've got to have the solutions to do it. We can't go and say, you're going to get to net zero. We've got to be able to say, let's get to net zero. This is how you're going to do it. And we have an understanding that it's going to work.
That's excellent, mate. You also spoke about the carbon project, implementation, and you've got observations about carbon projects. So just run us over that again. How did you start?
How did I start? From the carbon accounting and the knowledge in the carbon space and doing the consulting work. And it was a case of clients coming to me and saying, we want to look at a carbon project, we want to undertake a carbon project. What does it mean? What are the implications? So now I do a lot of feasibility studies, how to integrate carbon enterprise into the existing business, whether the carbon enterprise is standalone profitable or not. And I haven't come across too many that are at this point in time.
Are viable?
Are viable, yep, because of the costs. So for me, in the wheat belt, if we're looking at an environmental planting trees, for an average wheat belt farmer to be carbon neutral, net zero themselves, before they even sell any carbon credits, they're going to need about 300 hectares of trees. That's with an average yield of about 5 tonnes of CO2 equivalent at an average price of about $50 to $55 a tonne.
And when you're a farm that's already 18% tree covered?
Yep. And then we talk about planting trees in a low production area from a cropping point of view. That area is a low production area for a reason, and that's going to translate through to the trees as well. So you go out into the eastern wheat belt, and we can look at yields of maybe a tonne or sub a tonne carbon dioxide equivalent, and it's going to cost us $2,000 to $3,000 to plant trees in that area. We need a lot of accies to repay us.
So who are the people, and it's mostly plantations that we're referring to here, not soil carbon? Or?
So I look at soil carbon as well. Rangelands, I work quite a lot with the now sunsetted HIR methodology. So guys that have already got projects, guys that have projects registered but haven't started them yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in regards to the plantation, well, not necessarily in regards to the plantation, I mean, you had some words to say regarding the type of projects that were coming to landholders and the types of landholders that were seeking out.
Yeah. I've seen some shonky contracts. I really have. Some really shonky contracts. I have seen one where the carbon developer wanted 60% of the ACCUs that were being produced over a 25-year period for managing the project, for not much. Landholders locked into contracts that they can't get out of, that have made selling their properties difficult to sell. When you're going into a carbon project, you're going into a relationship with a developer for 25 years. If you fall out with that developer in year 2 or 3, you've got problems because the break clauses are very difficult to break. And I can understand from the rangelands where you're in a cash-constrained environment at times, a lot of people got seduced by the big numbers of the carbon yield and the income, and the carbon yield that's been spaced on some places is just not there.
Well, it's not just rangelands. I mean, every business has...
it's everywhere, but rangelands is a really
abstract.
good example at that point, yeah.
And the observation would be, I think I'm putting words in your mouth here, but the type of person that goes looking for the opportunity is one that is looking for cash. And they're looking for cash for a reason.
I don't think they go looking for opportunity. I wouldn't say that. I think when you've got 10, 20 developers knocking on your door, you get worn down to a certain point and you go, yeah, okay, maybe I need to look into this. And the developer that's saying, yeah, we can get you $1 million a year that comes in. It's hard to walk away from that. But it's understanding that, okay, I'm going to take $1 million a year, but I've got to keep that carbon there for 25 years. And if I have a drought, if I have a fire, the risk is high. So for me, it's understanding those risks. If you've understood them and you've done your homework, no problem.
I've got one last question for you, and I'm going back to the biology side of things. Yeah. Going back to the biology side of things, and we did have the discussion around the fact that, well, agriculture of all the industries within Australia, aiming for net zero, is the only one with the biological component.
Yep.
And the unfairness where it's difficult for us to deal with that situation, where other industries, it's easier for them to actually forecast, understand, scope 3, etc.
Yeah. So this goes back to my position on carbon calculators and accounting for everything in the system. We're in a cyclical system. We pull carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. We turn it into a product that we can consume, and then we can convert it back into the atmosphere. We're in a closed loop system. So if our herd isn't changing, if our crop size isn't changing, we're just cycling through the system. Compared to a fossil fuel industry that is extracting carbon out of the ground that's been there for a long time and pumping it into the atmosphere. The only difference is that in our industry, we're converting carbon, which is a low impact, long-term greenhouse gas, in your livestock industry, into a short-term, high-impact greenhouse gas. And I'd like to know from the researchers, what is the real impact of that on a farm business?
So beyond the short-term nature of the current methodology, and is there scope to change?
Yeah.
Brilliant. My last question, sorry. Can we reach net zero?
I think farms are already there if we account for it properly.
If we account for it properly.
Some farms don't. We can't count the bushland.
Yep.
That's ours. We own that. Why can't I count it? Why can't I account for the carbon that I'm pulling out of the atmosphere? But I'm also putting some back in.
Yeah.
So to reach net zero, I think on an intensity basis, yes. On a whole farm basis, no. So we've got to be very clear as an industry, as a society, what do we want to achieve?
Yeah, so, and the society part is the education piece beyond our borders.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Thanks, Richard. That was great. Debbie, please, yes, turn your microphone on. So, Deb, which I have not met before.
No, not yet.
Welcome. Deb owns a station business in the Southern Rangelands, so please could you tell the audience how you ply your trade?
Absolutely. So my husband and I run Chalice Station, which is roughly in the middle of the Southern Rangelands of Western Australia. Now, I've got to paint a picture for you. We all know about the wheat belt. Let's take it a step higher and talk about what I like to refer to as the carbon belt. That's the Southern Rangelands. It's all the station country south of the Pilbara. It comprises 53 million hectares of Western Australia, and Ash and I are right and bang in the middle of the Southern Rangelands. So we have 200,000 hectares. We run approximately, on average, 1,800 head of cattle, and we have a human-induced regeneration carbon project, which we have monetised for the last 4 years or so. And our carbon project started off, as many of them did in our area, by carbon companies approaching us prior to November 2019, which was when the state government allowed pastoralists to monetise carbon projects. So we were being approached by carbon companies for a while prior to 2019. We kept saying, go away, we don't grow trees, we grow cows, go away, we're not interested. Until we became involved with a company that had a gentleman working for them who was very familiar with our production system and explained to us how well it would work in with our production system and how we are controlling the timing and the extent of the grazing of the cattle in order to allow the native forest to regrow. And we saw that as a win-win situation because it means that we can look after our station better, which has been in the family since 1888, so we are very invested in looking after our landscape. And we can also apply those co-benefits to our business. When you've got a healthy landscape, you've got healthy cattle, and what's good for the birds is good for the herds. So the Southern Rangelands is completely opposite. I mean, I hear all this doom and gloom about agriculture not reaching net zero. I'm like, come on guys, we're so carbon positive in our area, it's not funny. One of the things we find though is we haven't been measured properly. We know that we're carbon positive because it's been monetised through the Clean Energy Regulator, and we had auditors come from the Clean Energy Regulator in May this year and from the auditing company and from our carbon company and measured and checked and everything like that to make sure we actually are sequestering what we say we are or what we're claiming. But we're very carbon positive, but one of the problems that we have with our property, with our produce, is that the meat that we produce in our incredibly carbon positive environment, we sell into the local markets in Perth, and we can expect to have a discount of between 30 and 60 cents a kilo for our meat because it's pastoral. So the markets for carbon positive meat or even carbon neutral meat are just not there. And I would love it if we could at least reach price parity because of the strength of our carbon project and the strength of our environmental resilience on our property.
So you've had trouble marketing your net positive product?
We've spoken to our agent and we've explored a lot of different opportunities, but because the Southern Rangelands is the Siberia of agriculture, we've been ignored for so long. And I've spoken to our agent, I said, well, what about carbon neutral? And he said, oh, no one cares about that. No one's interested in that. And then you're such a small voice, and what we're trying to do is develop some traceability through the market so that we can go to perhaps the EU and say, this is our carbon positive meat and we don't do any deforestation. Our cattle grow within the mulga woodlands, but it's just so difficult for a little producer like us to reach out to the markets like that across the other side of the world and be recognised for what we do.
A lot of energy, a lot of capital, a lot of time.
And it's way beyond our skill set.
And there's no platform. You're saying you haven't found the right platform locally to actually do that for you?
No, we're really working with some ag tech companies and trying to develop some sort of traceability, but even then it's really hard to get that funded.
So let's just take a step back. The project you've got up and running for the last 4 years, what change in management has literally occurred on the farm to enable it to be considered a bona fide project?
Yeah, we had to change our management. So the first and most noticeable thing we did is reduced our cattle numbers by a third. Yep. And then we have controlled their grazing using self-herding techniques where you deploy certain attractants around the areas where you want the cattle to navigate to, and they will naturally congregate in those areas where they have those attractants. In addition to that, we've put satellite tracking ear tags in the cows' ears so we can prove that they're going where we think they're going. We've turned waters off, or we've completely removed waters from certain areas, and we've fenced off other areas that we don't want the cattle to go into. So we know that the cattle, they're grazing basically on the grasslands, and they'll pop into the mulga woodlands for a look, but there's not a lot of motivation for them to stay in there and eat a lot because there's better grazing away from there, and there's not that many cattle, and we're not grazing the country so heavily that they need to go and eat the regrowing native trees.
Fascinating. And so you actually have reduced your production.
Yep.
Well, numbers.
Yes, we've reduced our numbers, and we're focusing on the efficiency of the herd. So because we've reduced our numbers, we want every animal on the station to be a breeding machine and a meat producing machine. So we've recently found ourselves a very good station hand who can preg test for us, and that's a massive thing in the southern rangelands. We're so far away from any vets, it's prohibitively expensive to conduct preg testing, but we've got a person who can come in and who works for us and can do our preg testing for us, and that means that we can then go through the cows and say, right, where's your calf? Haven't got one, not pregnant? Right, out you go. And we go right through the whole lot of them. And if they're not producing what we need them to produce, they're off.
The heart of the cow.
So we can still maintain our profitability with lower numbers.
So the harder the cow, the better the herd.
Yep.
Right. We spoke a bit before about, I mean, you spoke at length about the project itself and some of the calculations and the difficulty for you in having the confidence in the calculations, not necessarily in the project itself, but the landscape, etc. Do you want to just elaborate to the crowd a bit about that?
Well, I did. We know that we are carbon positive. We know because we sell accus, and that is so tightly interrogated that we have complete confidence in that. But that's just the regrowing native trees. So areas of forest which are expected to reach 20% canopy cover at 2 metres tall within the 25-year period. We've got a lot of other trees and we've got a lot of other shrubs and bushes which are also sequestering carbon. So I went onto the MLA quick start calculator and I punched in the numbers, and that said we probably are storing somewhere in the region of nearly 1 million tonnes of carbon a year. And then I go, oh, that sounds good. Well, I better do the numbers a bit more. So I went into the MLA slow calculator and I punched in the first page. It says, which region are you? Kimberley, Pilbara or Southwest? I'm like, oh, okay, nowhere. So I pretended I was in the Pilbara, and then I went on a bit further and it said, how many hectares of savanna burning do you do? And I gave up there. We don't do savanna burning. So we can't possibly use the MLA calculators at this point in time to get a real accurate picture of our whole carbon story across the station.
So it's the calculators for you are requiring far more, similar story to what you were talking about, far more information built in, downscaled to your location.
And, you know, one of the other things on our property, we've had some research done with UWA, and we know that our cattle are eating anti-methanogenic plants. We know that for a fact because I got the cow poo straight from the cows, and I put it in containers and brought it down to the lab here at CSIRO, and they analysed, they metabarcoded the plant DNA samples in the cow poo, and they know that our cows are eating plants which have anti-methanogenic properties. Now, any researchers in the room, that's where we need to go, because we're probably way overestimating the carbon calculations for the rangelands cattle because of the anti-methanogenic plants they're eating. Very early days for this, and we really want to explore it further and actually get some real numbers for our cattle and not have them based on some desktop assessment by some person in Canberra who's never been on the property and hasn't got a clue and doesn't know what plants we've got and doesn't know our production system yet. So there's a long way to go before we we can have a carbon calculator that really reflects what's happening in a whole property in the southern rangelands.
That's meaningful to your location.
That's meaningful for our location.
As opposed to one size fits all.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And I'm sorry,
Right.
I've got to add that the rangelands are 80% of Western Australia and 54% of the Earth's surface. So when we're looking at agriculture, it's so easy to look at cropping and intensive agriculture and things like that. But we really need to broaden the lens and look at the rangelands internationally and look at the level of land degradation in the rangelands and look at interventions that we can do to arrest that degradation and to improve the land condition right through the rangelands. And I think that the nature repair market is something that has the potential to really supercharge land restoration in the rangelands and repair that huge carbon sink that we've got that's being underutilised. And it's also going to help impoverished people across the globe.
So, yeah, excellent. That's great. How much? Yes. In your community, which is a vast community, let's be honest, has everyone jumped on the same bandwagon with a similar project, or what's the mood out there?
There are a lot of properties that weren't eligible, so you have to have been running livestock continuously prior to having your carbon projects. So a lot of properties, because of the wild dogs that came into the southern rangelands, a lot of properties had destocked and they didn't have any livestock on their property for the 10 years prior to the baseline commencement. And luckily, Ashley and I, we made a very quick switch from sheep to cattle, knowing that the wild dogs were not going to allow us to run our sheep anymore. So we switched to cattle, and we've also had rangelands goats on the property for a long time. They're all gone now, thanks to the dogs. And so we were eligible for a carbon project. So a lot of carbon projects have also got to a certain stage, but have been unable to reach an agreement with the native title holders, so have not been able to be monetised. So out of the carbon projects, I think there's 157 that were initially registered in the southern rangelands. It's only about 20-25% that have actually become monetised because of the barriers that have been in the way. And we're very fortunate that we're in the position that we are, and that's why I think it's really important for us to be in front of an audience like this and telling people about the carbon projects in the southern rangelands and how much benefit they're doing to our community and hopefully to the global community as well.
So, great segue. Barriers. I mean, you've spoken a lot, well, I've asked you a lot of questions about the project side of things and the impact on your business and etc. Have you adopted anything else into the business in terms of, from a production perspective, like the seaweed, the gut seaweed, or any other practice that would help you reduce your own emission, as opposed to abating?
No, we haven't, and we'd be very happy to do that once we had a true carbon measurement, but we're kind of a bit interested in this, in the antimethanogenic plants that the cattle are eating, and we think that rather than jumping in and making all the cows eat asparaginopsis, which is impossible in a rangeland situation anyway, we really need to get that baseline measurement accurate and then to deploy interventions probably into the water for the cattle or in a rumen bolus that might have an effect. You can also look at genetically selecting cattle for low carbon or low methane emissions as well, and that's certainly somewhere where we would be looking at going.
I'm being given the heave-ho.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think what I'm hearing is that from you, in regards to this, the R&D required to not only generate new products that you might be able to utilise, but also reduce the cost of existing products is paramount.
Yeah, because you can't lower your methane if you also lower your profits. Yeah. Lowering methane needs to coincide with a return on investment, just like any other business decision. And we're looking at agriculture reaching net zero. We're actually fundamentally talking about changing human behaviour. And as we know, humans who work the land or work in any business are motivated by return on investment. So if we can increase our return on investment by becoming net zero, or by lowering our methane, or by doing any other interventions that we need to do, then farmers will broadly adopt that. And until that becomes real, the industry will just be sort of dabbling on the edges of net zero. We're not really going to wholeheartedly leap into that idea.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Debbie. Thank you very much. I better keep moving. So, Peter, lucky last. I've known Peter for a long, long time. He had many positions in the industry, including very high-ranking ones within government agencies. So tell us, can you tell the audience today what it is that you ply your trade with every day?
Yeah, sure. So I work for a little organisation called Inter-Earth. Inter-Earth is a carbon dioxide reduction, or nature-based carbon dioxide reduction solution, which is code for we grow trees, we coppice them, we dry them, store them, preserve them in a chamber for up to 100 years, and we get the credits paid off that. That system ensures that the issues that Michael and others raised earlier on, in terms of the vegetation, you can actually harvest a lot of our native species at ground level, and they coppice back again quite quickly, and the yields are substantially higher than we mentioned earlier on. That does provide an additional income stream. It also moves away from perpetual forests. Some of our investors are Zurich Bank, for example. They're very concerned about perpetual forests in terms of posing fire risks, and because of the increasing variation in climate going forward, that poses a significant challenge for them. This way, we put them into 10,000 tonne chambers, put a waterproof membrane over the top, a metre of soil over the top of that, seal it, then put vents into it so that it's well ventilated and dried, and the timber stays there for 100 years, preserved very much like it is in the roof of most buildings.
Brilliant. So another option, R&D that's come through to develop another opportunity. So we talked a lot about, and you spoke at length about WA's or agriculture's competitive advantage, and in particular Western Australian agriculture competitive advantage. So do you want to elaborate to the audience some thoughts? Sure.
So in this space, as Ross will tell you, whoever can do this the most efficiently in comparison to our competitors can achieve a price advantage on the way through. So if our competitive advantage is that we've got very innovative growers, and there's an innovative research organisation that supports us. We're very, very well connected through the wheat belt. We've got an enormous number of grower groups and a great deal of really good forward-thinking people that are keen to have a go. That's important. I guess the other part of it is that's a little bit different for us, is that we do, for grains industry in particular, we've got CBH, where we have some control over the supply chain or the transport network out to our end users, and CBH is doing some early stage trials there to schedule shipping and reduce emissions on that through, and growers can because we're in that cooperative, that actually helps. I think the third part of it, which is the important bit, is we do actually have large areas in the state that are not well suited to agriculture, and whether it's cropping or grazing, and there are opportunities there to plant species that are well adapted to those areas, native species that are well adapted to that. Most of our native species do coppice very well, and you can harvest those and reset them. So I think that's, and I think against that, the growers, as a result of being far more united and connected, going forward it will be very important for us to have a single united voice. There will be a lot of policies, just as Tony Seabrook and others have pointed out, that will actually have unintended consequences on agriculture as we move forward. And having the ability to be able to speak unitedly and well informed about what impacts they're having and providing evidence will be critical. Yeah. So I think there are other competitive advantages, but I think they're unique competitive advantages for us.
Yeah, okay. So I'm hearing you say that as a the likelihood or the opportunity for us to actually reach net zero is real or is possible. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's great because you haven't put a time frame on it, so that's terrific. The other bit of it is I'm with the other speakers. You're not going to do it off emissions reductions and you're not going to do it off carbon sequestration. You'll have to have CDRs in that process. Now, those CDRs, we've got one at the moment. There's other research and innovation going on in that space that will contribute to it as well, and they'll emerge over time. But I don't think you'll be able to sequester all of the carbons out of the system. I know that off conversations I've had with growers that have been monitoring for a while, and they're running at about 80%, and they do need to be able to have some way to offset that and use their own material to be able to do that. Planting perpetual forests on their own farms and then be able to harvest those every 5 to 7 years and store that and then harvest it again puts you in a very different position than if you're just running planting and severely, because those plantations thin out in age and disease gets into them, one thing and another, and decline in productivity over time. So that carbon sink becomes saturated, as it does with Michael's comments earlier on with the soil carbon sink. That also can become saturated, and things can happen that add risk to that as well. So this is an option that manages some of the risks. Yes, we don't. So just to be clear, the material that's harvested and stored, that's stored on farm. We don't shift this any further than 2 kilometres from where it comes from. We don't bring it to Perth or do anything fancy with it.
Yep. So I'm just going to take a step back then and talk about some of the unintended consequences that you mentioned. I mean, agriculture is but one industry.
Yep.
And there are other industries that are also needing to be net zero to reach the state's mandate, etc. You spoke a bit about, gave me a few clear examples where some policies could lead to issues that we have not yet thought about within agriculture. Would you like to elaborate a little bit for the crowd?
I think Tony's photos of aeroplanes and boats that don't go anywhere are great examples. But for example, the big emitters are concrete manufacturing, for example, emits an enormous amount of energy, consumes energy and emits a lot. So the big emitters at some point will be taxed. As soon as they do that, that'll jack up the price, that'll make input costs for farming more expensive, constructing roads, other things, railway sleepers, all those, they're made of concrete. There's a whole range of stuff that will feed into that. Buildings, housing, everything else will go up off the back of taxing concrete by one emitter. Someone else, I think, coal-powered fire stations are disappearing sometime soon. Yep, good on you. So that'll be nuclear, no runner with the opposition, it's easy. So someone will join the dots and say, actually, reducing refined fuel, or not refining fuel anymore, is a good outcome. Well, it is, perhaps, for emissions. Not a good outcome if you're a road builder. The cheap byproduct that comes out of oil refining is tar. You need a fair bit of that to mix with bitumen to actually build roads. Now, all of those are going to add additional costs back into the farming sector, back into all of our lives.
Regional people.
Well, regional people in particular will wear the brunt of that, but also, just here in Perth, the cost of housing and those sorts of things will all increase as a result. Recently, Denmark introduced a $145 dairy cow tax for the emissions. The price of milk is obviously going to go up. The unintended consequences of that will be that the health outcomes, because calcium in milk is a primary source of calcium for young and aged, health outcomes will actually be compromised on the way through. So it's not a one-dimensional, stick it in here and it'll result in this, like playing pool. This is a systemic, multi-dimensional, almost extremely difficult to actually unfathom how it's actually going to play out in the unintended ways. And so I remember back in the dream time, we were talking about peak oil, and I bought my first V8 ute, and I thought, well, the days of running the ute's going to be over pretty soon. I haven't got a ute anymore, I bought a station wagon, but still running that, thanks Tony. So we worked our way through that and resolved all the issues that went with that, improved fuel efficiency, got rid of some of the noise that went with it. I think this will play out in a similar way. We're bumbling around at the moment trying to find our ways. We're making some not well-informed decisions on the way through, and the unintended consequences of, a simple one like the federal government's decided that renewables are the go, so stimulate renewables. I don't know if you've been, or you probably haven't, but if you've been to Geraldton and driven from Geraldton out to Mullawar, there's a whole pile of power infrastructure there that already exists. No surprise, the first place they want to put solar and wind farms is straight underneath that infrastructure. So the real estate prices went through the roof along that network. You go out the Graziers Highway, funny thing, same thing happened there. So it had a ripple effect where real estate prices across the wheat belt went up. They're now questionably asked, I'm being asked, are they reflecting production prices? Well, there's a pretty strong possibility they might actually be reflecting green energy or renewable prices or other sources of income other than agricultural related production. And current land values, the ones I've been looking at Esperance, at $10,000 a hectare, there's no way on earth they're reflecting current production. So those sorts of, and in amongst that, that will make it harder for the industry to restructure. It'll make it harder if you get in, pretty hard, a hell of a lot harder for you to, sorry, easy for you to get out, but a lot harder for you to get in. So the bigger operators that have already got 80, 90% equity, buy another property, that's pretty straightforward. But for the other ones that are still trying to expand, it actually becomes harder going forward. So it will have, so that's a simple one, but it's amazing how complex it becomes just in a couple of conversations.
That's right, and difficult to predict.
Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, well, thank you. Look, I know I'm going to get the heave-ho in a second, so can you please put your hands together for the panel for giving the time. Thank you very much. So we're going to invite Ross. Could you come up, please, Ross, as well? And Michael and Tony has already sorted himself out. It's open to the floor now, so I hope you've got your thinking caps on. They are yours to talk to, so please ask some questions.
Thanks very much, Rob. We will do.
Yeah, he's all right.
Are you going to do questions? You're going to control it, right? Donna,
You stay up with me, mate. Right, so we had two roaming mics, please. The lady that was in the middle there, that's Jackie, yes, that's right. There's a microphone coming. And then the lady.
Thank you. So I'm Jackie Bucat with Deepherd. Thank you, it's been a wonderful day and I think it's been really balanced, which is really pleasing. So Michael, a balanced one, I had a quite an important clarification. So you talked about cover crops and it was one of the very few things that worked for soil carbon. Did you mean what we call summer crops? Now I've got a follow-up, but...
It's okay? I think I did. Across Australia, they sometimes use, from an economic perspective, use slightly different terminologies in different places. The concept of the summer crop being essentially sown, in most cases, on summer rains, where they do come. The concept of a cover crop being sown deliberately, irrespective of when the rainfall is. Might be just a bit of a loss in translation thing. The main point being trying to get green growing material for the longer period of the year.
Yep. And you pointed out how difficult it is to always know when that's going to happen, that you increase your soil carbon. Are there any guides out there to the panel, or should there be, or what's the best thing people can go into these things and know that they're going to have a success or not for the soil carbon sequestration?
Yeah. In speaking to his audience and recognising diversity of backgrounds and perspectives, it really is a place-based solution, place-based answer. And there's plenty of places in Australia where you can have a reasonable degree of confidence that if you implement these practices, you'll lead to increases in carbon. Yeah, they could be going from, let's stop cropping and sow perennial pastures down. Yes, you're going to increase your soil carbon. Is that what you want to do from a farm business perspective and those sort of trade-offs? But more generally speaking, some of those, and in other parts of the country, it's even about adapting some smart grazing practice, good grazing management. There's been pastures that are overstocked, poorly stocked, and applying some good grazing management that reduces the grazing pressure at certain times of the year, helps to sequester soil carbon.
Go there, and then we'll come down to this gentleman after that.
Thank you for your presentation, Michael. It's Louise Edmonds here, CEO of Carbon Sync. We're a soil carbon farming project developer. So, Michael, I don't know how long ago, well, how recently you spoke with the developer, but I think there's a lot of updates that I'd like to share with you later. But just a couple of the headlines. We're at $6 per hectare per year for direct measurement. That in no way undermines the rigour of the statistical analysis, and that's a viable position for a carbon farming project. The other thing, you raised quite a few issues in relation to additionality and various other aspects that are now well covered through the methodology, so I think we've got that sorted out. There is an area that we do need support though, and that's in the making and the maintaining, and I think there's a lot of research to be done in that respect. We heard earlier from Tony talking about that 10x increase in productivity that
Sorry, Louise, have you got a question?
Have I got a question? I actually just want to say that I really do believe that it is possible to get to net zero. And, you know, with some of the data from Richard demonstrating, you know, 5 times the amount of sequestration compared to the emissions on a farm at a very low sequestration rate, like 0.25% over the life of a project, which is tiny. So I don't think it's time to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if anyone's interested in, you know, hearing our direct experiences of what is possible, we would love to share that.
All right, thank you.
There are a few things that I'll need to respond to there. So talking about the cost of measurement and, you know, the target of $3, yes, we're only under $6, and that's the point I was making as a result of the significant government investment, $50 billion in the carbon methodology, carbon measurement space. There's been some great initiatives through our university sector, through the private sector, working in partnership internationally, and we are through remote sensing, through modelling, etc., getting those prices down. And sort of just picks up the point that Rebecca made. I didn't say that achieving net emissions wasn't possible. I answered the question, is agriculture going to achieve net emissions? I said no. I didn't say it's not possible, I just said we're not going to do it. I also had the caveat that individual farms will do it. Individual sectors will do it. But collectively, all of agriculture, all of Australia, I don't see it happening.
And predictions are made to be wrong, which is, but that's good, I like it. Please, here.
Okay. Just coming from a historical anthropological point of view, if we go back to, say, 1760 as a benchmark year for pre-industrial, since that time, atmospheric CO2 has increased by 0.01%, where the human population since that time has increased by over 1,100%. Okay? So the net per capita emissions over that period has plummeted. Now it follows, with all the huge growth in cities and industry and agriculture that supports that population, likewise the net unit increase has plummeted. Now the question comes about of how much more work will bring such rapidly diminishing returns. Okay, what sort of greater investment are we going to get to bring sort of any greater returns than we've already achieved?
Who's your question
science
to?
And technology and whatever.
Who's your question to?
Well,
you want to have a go, Ross?
As I understand the question, I think the issue is not that our emissions per capita have changed. What is affecting the climate for each of us is the aggregate emissions. So it's over the decades, it's the change in the aggregate emissions that scientists are telling us is influencing the climate. And therefore, what we do individually, what we do as nations, at a personal or household level, we are each responsible for how we live and whether we worsen or improve that situation. But to be collectively effective, the focus must be on aggregate emissions.
Well said.
Just my question is more about what more can we do to meet that obligation when the greater effort we put in brings diminishing returns.
Sure. So the economist in me says that you start with the low-hanging fruit. So you reduce emissions where it's most easy to do that. And obviously in the energy sector, we are trying to do that. A switch away from carbon-based energy sources into others not, such as renewable or nuclear, is a pretty quick way of reducing aggregate emissions. As people have said on the panel, when it comes to agriculture, it's more difficult because we are dealing with a biological system that has embedded in it a natural flow of emissions. So changing ruminant biology is not something simple to do. So I would not be starting with agriculture if I wanted to reduce aggregate emissions.
Michael?
Yeah. Also, just to challenge the opening premise of your question, don't confuse a change in percentage units with a percentage change. To say there's 0.01% increase, as a percentage of our total atmosphere, CO2 is a very small amount. So it's only increased by a small amount of our total atmosphere. But we've gone from 250 parts per million in those days to 330 million parts per million when I was born to well over 400 parts per million now. We've had close to 100% increase. We've had a 50, 60, 70% increase in our CO2 in the atmosphere. And all we're tracking is, we'll be going up towards 500, 550 within our lifetime.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Now, up the back.
Thank you very much, Rob. Philip Gardner. First of all, Tony Seabrook, thank you for putting quality farming into perspective. My question really is about the little elephant in the room. Science is going to be very important in all this we know. The little elephant in the room is methane, enteric methane, and we know that methane is calculated highly as an emitting gas for livestock. However, there's an alternative view by a chap called Mitt Lerner from the University of California, which says that the carbon coming in through photosynthesis to the animal is equal to that going out with methane enterically, not manure, enterically. If that's the case, isn't that going to change a lot of the pressure on agriculture in getting its emissions down, especially for those, in particular for those who've got livestock?
Who's going to tackle that? Have a go, Peter.
Phil, one thing I'd say, and I don't know if this is for certain, but the work that I understand has been done on methane emissions from cattle is largely done with captive animals in feedlots. These animals don't eat the same diet in a feedlot as they do out in the bush. And Debbie, what you were saying earlier on about analysing what the animals are actually consuming, I'd be very keen to know whether the methane from range-fed sheep and cattle is the same as that from animals that are on a grain diet, which is not a normal diet for them.
You're right, it's not.
It's not. That's the point. Yeah.
And the other issue I was trying to make, I'm not saying that we ought not to be concerned about what's happening, but I was trying to say, let's not here in this room today in the state of West Australia throw agriculture under the bus. Because when you go to Brazil, I have no idea what they're doing over there. When you talk about 238 million head of cattle and 2 million in West Australia, let's get real about this. When the rest of the world is prepared to move with us, we move with them. But to try and be leaders in this field, to no benefit to ourselves, it will not end happily.
Peter?
There is a discussion. I think this one's working. There is a discussion at the moment the cattle industry is having around what how methane is calculated the argument is that it's cyclical and it stays in the system for 12 years, and as a result of being cyclical and drops out, then why is it cumulative when you put it into the IPCC carbon equivalents? If they pull that off, then methane will flat level in the livestock industry unless the livestock numbers increase, not be cumulative as it currently is, in which case it will be a game changer. So the rules around accounting processes going forward, it's early days, it's a bit like the early days of superannuation funds. It's not for the faint-hearted. And I think this is the same category. So it'll take a while, the science behind it will get formed up. In the event that does happen, the conversation will shift off the livestock industry very quickly to the grains industry. It's great that it's on the livestock industry at the moment, but yeah.
Which is exactly what Ross said, yeah, that's correct. Now, Kirsty.
Kirsty Smith from Nutrien, and thank you to all the speakers today. I guess I just had a bit of a question. Probably it was in regards to Debbie. You made the comment that you have a successful carbon project, which is great, and you're selling accus and monetise that, which essentially means you've sold it out of the industry. You're then having trouble monetising the cattle that you're trying to sell as carbon positive, which was my understanding that you can't sort of double account for that as an inset. So I guess this question broadly to anyone, Richard, Ross, Debbie Beck or whoever, this seems to be a bit of a market failure between the costs of abatement and insetting versus this offset market, and what the outcome is there.
So for us to, we can't claim those accus that we sell, but they're directly linked to the regrowing native vegetation. But if we can include the other accus or the other carbon that we sequester, like the bushes, the plants under 2 metres, the already grown forest, there's a significant amount of carbon that we're not allowing for in our carbon project. So the carbon project is just a portion of our carbon. So we can still monetise that, and we can, if we could get the calculations right and if we could get the science right, there might be an opportunity to prove that we have our carbon positive cattle. But at the moment, as I said, we're just so largely ignored in the market that it's not something that's even on anybody's radar.
So I'll back that up, that at the moment, from the double accounting point of view, from carbon projects, we either sell it off or we've got to keep it within our own business. And within our own business, we need every single accu that we've got and then some to make ourselves carbon neutral, net zero. But if we account for the whole system, as Debbie's talking about, then that's a game changer. But to me, we can't pick the eyes out, or we can't be selective about the system that we're measuring. We've got to account for the whole system, or you don't count for anything.
So one at the back and then we'll come across here.
Question for Peter Meercart. This probably upset a few people in the room. Peter, you've had a long career in encouraging governments to make brave decisions. Should the state government be reversing its decision on old growth forests and allowing us to harvest those forests and essentially bury it and sequester that carbon?
Yeah, good on you. I think I'll stay away from that one, thanks, Trev. I'm pretty sure they want us to plant some trees and draw down the water tables and the wheat belt and do other things that are consistent with improving the sustainability and the health of the wheat belt and the rangelands. And I'll leave the old forest growth alone, I think. Thanks.
But I want to add something here. Those of us who were very early adopters in this sort of replanting of the wheat belt, and my father fenced off most of our sort of second grade country, most of our salt country, and we started planting trees in the 1950s. I'm way beyond being able to claim all this stuff. As you said before, we got in too soon, we tried too hard, and we shot ourselves in the foot. But as Ross showed a while ago, burning is a significant contributor. And I'm appalled every year when I actually have to go and burn the stubbles to plant the next year's crop. But we've got some of the best gear that you can buy to plant into stubble, retained stubble, but it will not handle the sorts of stubble that we're growing. You grow a 5 or 6 tonne wheat crop, and there's just too much stubble there to sow into. The other alternative then is to smash it to pieces with the harvester. Harvesters are designed to harvest grain, not smash up stubble. You burn up a huge amount of fuel and you slow your harvesting operation down by 40-50%, even more sometimes, trying to digest all of that material and smash it to bits so that you can shove it in the back of the machine and then sow into it. So we've got a really big problem in trying to deal with the sort of stubbles we're growing to be able to plant next year's crop. I don't have any answers there, but I hate going out of the box matches and doing what we do, but we're doing it because we have to.
Over here.
Oh, hello, Wallace Taylor, UWA. A very quick question for Rebecca. I was really interested to hear that you've got rid of all the sheep and you're now resting paddocks with a cover crop or a pasture, and have you calculated the benefit of that in carbon capture and the reduction in nitrogen use the following year? Thank you.
Richard just said, ask my consultant.
Don't ask me.
Look, we haven't looked into it too much. We do get a yield increase the following year, but we haven't done the calculations on it and gone further than that. We do it, so we are commercially licensed for pasture seed, so we do end up using it as a commercial crop still, but it is primarily for soil health.
One question here, and we might have time for one more after that.
Quick question for Peter. If you can do it for trees for 100 years, why can't...
Oh, sorry, it was behind you, yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Peter, if you can do it for trees for 100, you store them for 100 years, why can't you store the stubble?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think it's just a bulk density issue. To store the stubble, you have to compress it down into very, enormous amount of energy. The trees are, so one kilo of tree is equivalent to 1 kilo of carbon. And in the case of stubble, it's a hell of a lot fluffier and bulkier, and so it's simply ours is just a freight logistics job largely. There's nothing very clever about it. Just being able to do low cost bulk, low cost commodity, and move it not very far, and then cover it over and preserve it. The stubble poses a much bigger challenge. 10,000 tonne stacks. Let's say for if it's blue gums, 150 hectares is three big stacks, 4 big stacks to actually put that in. They're 30 metres wide and 300 metres long. So they're decent sized mounds of dirt. Stubble would be a lot harder.
If I'd add to that, to actually rake that stubble and put it through a bale, you're talking $30 to $40 a tonne just to get a guy to come onto your property with a bale to bale it. Then you've got to go and get the stuff, take it to a hole where you'd like to go. So we are trying in every way we can to work our way around this, but at the moment, to see the amount of energy that comes out of a stubble fire is absolutely huge, but to work out how to use it is the challenge.
Last question.
Doug Hall, thanks very much. I'd like to raise the issue of permanency under methodologies. Now, I'm happy to be corrected, but there's 25-year permanency and the 100-year permanency projects. Now, my understanding of the legislation is that once that permanency period is finished, and you've got your income prior to that, you then have a responsibility to maintain that fixed carbon. And obviously from a climate change point of view, if carbon is causing it, then that's an absolute imperative. Now, Peter, so there's a question about how do you fund that ongoing responsibility to maintain that fixed carbon so that it is permanently removed from the atmosphere and therefore helping address the climate change issue. Now, Peter, you've correctly identified the ecological plateauing problem, and you're addressing that by clearing. Specifically, a question there is, if you're using native vegetation, how are you overcoming, and particularly trees, how are you overcoming the native vegetation clearing regulations? Because my understanding is 20 years and then it triggers it, so if you're harvesting before then, it's probably not a problem. But anyway, if you could answer that, that'd be great.
Just so we're crystal clear, we're not clearing anything. We're planting trees, which I did say, planting them, coppicing them, drying them and storing them. There's no clearing bit in there at all. So that's fine. We've also got third-party biomass included in that, so if Tony's got a pile of trees on his place that he's thinking about pushing over or has pushed over and wants to set fire to them, we'll come and pick them up and put them in a chamber and preserve them for the next 100 years for his grandkids. I'm happy to do that. The cost in maintaining that over that 100-year period is on us. We pay you $20 a tonne for green or dry biomass, and we then bear the cost of maintaining that for that 100-year period. As for the legislation, the system that we operate in is conducted through Wall Street, through Bureau registration. It's not tied to the government accounting program that runs in Australia. It's with Wall Street on a commercial footing there to make sure that in the event that there are changes in political parties or persuasions, they don't change the rules on the way through. And so it's and that's the reason we've gone in that direction.
Just to follow up, I mean, understand what you've described as under another system, but surely from a climate change ecosystem point of view, after your responsibility of 100 years is closed off under your framework, that still has to be maintained as secured. So who then funds that? And that is then going to be an impost on the business or whatever, the farmer. And to me, this is the... when I was doing policy work in this area for PGA, my grave concern for the members was that they had a future financial liability that they were not necessarily fully aware of. And that is going to potentially kill your business when it's like going off a cliff at that end of the permanency period if you haven't understood that financial impost into the future, and it's into the future, if carbon is truly causing climate change.
Thanks. Just so we're clear, in this case, the agreement that we've got with the landholder is that it's preserved for 100 years. I can guarantee you that at the end of the 100 years, we'll be just as happy to either renegotiate that arrangement again, understanding that, so the person that buys the credits has confidence that it's held for 100 years. At the end of the 100 years, I will resell that credit to the next person to maintain permanency. That's how it'll work. There's not a liability at the end of this that we're moving on to a grower.
Thanks, Peter. We better call it to a close now. Can you join me, please, in thanking the panellists today? Over to you.
I think you all can go now. Thank you. We just need... Thank you. We're going to wrap. We won't take more time. Thank you very much for your terrific panel facilitation. Rob, very well done. I realize Rob was my honours student here co-supervised with Professor Alan Robson. So he has done extremely well. So once again, thanks, Rob. Would you please join me once again in thanking Rob, Terry, our panelists, and all our speakers for sharing their expertise and invaluable insight. Thanks also to members of our Industry Advisory Board, CSBP Fertilizers, my team at the UWA Institute of Agriculture, and everyone who helped make today's event such a success. Today's program has been recorded and will go into the YouTube, and hopefully either by end of the week it will be available so you can listen to that and share with your colleagues. And on the event program, we have a survey which we want you to respond for two things. One is how the day went, some suggestions for the future. And the industry forum will be held again middle of next year, 2025. But we have a few other programs coming. This is an important event, Hector and Andrew Stewart Memorial Lecture, delivered by the Consultative Group for International Agriculture Research, Executive Managing Director, Dr. Ismail Lafi. To get her, it has been a very big effort, and it will be fantastic. It is a free event on 8th of August, 5:15 p.m. at the Wilsmore Lecture Theatre. Again, please do register. Then the last program of the year is Shendon Parkfield Station Open Day, and that's on the 13th of September. There's a lot of activities, not only agriculture, but including agriculture, engineering, and other areas. Again, free, please to register. The program has now drawn to a close, but the next part is equally important. I think there is a lot more questions people want to ask to the panelists and the presenters. Now I invite you all to join me for some refreshments and networking at our sundowner. Please exit via this door on your right. That's on my left here, this way. And then turn right again to make your way up to the terrace. I look forward to joining you for a drink, some nibbles, and a catch up. Thank you everyone, once again.